Angels, Giants, a banned book that didn't make the final cut of the Bible. Most people hear the Book of Enoch and immediately think of secret prophecies, fallen angels, and late-night theories about the Nephilim shaping human history. But beneath all that sensational noise, there's something far more grounded and honestly far more human happening in these ancient pages. The people who first heard the Book of Enoch weren't decoding cosmic conspiracies. They were trying to survive another year of bad harvests, unpredictable rulers, and the unsettling feeling that the world didn't quite run the way it was supposed to. However, here's the twist. The Book of Enoch doesn't simply say, angels fell and things got bad. It quietly suggests that the mess of human existence, the violence, the injustice, the constant instability, might trace back to superhuman beings who were supposed to watch over the world and instead wandered off the job description entirely. It's not exactly the warmest bedtime story, yet tonight that's exactly the story we're going to ease into slowly and calmly. Welcome back to the Sleep Atlas. Tonight we're taking a steady, unhurried look at one of history's strangest texts, the Book of Enoch, the ancient narrative that expands the story of Genesis with rogue angels, mysterious knowledge, and giants who weren't supposed to exist. We'll explore who the Watchers were meant to be, how they fell, why their actions reshaped the world, and why this book hovered right on the edge of the biblical canon. All without rushing, and without the dramatic flair that usually follows these characters around. Before we begin, if you enjoy these long, quiet journeys through forgotten history and ancient mysteries, feel free to like the video and subscribe. Subscribe to continue exploring the enigmatic corners of history that make peaceful companions for sleep. And if you're awake enough to type, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now that the stage is set, we can begin with the world that created this story. A world where life was fragile, empires loomed large, the night sky felt alive, and the idea of watchers wasn't fantasy, it was emotional logic. Chapter 1. A world out of balance, daily life before the fall. Picture life in the ancient Near East long before the Book of Enoch was ever written. Not the Hollywood version with sweeping orchestral soundtracks and golden desert sunsets, but the real, unembellished, slightly uncomfortable version that most people lived every single day. Your world is small, maybe a few square miles at most. Your routines are predictable in a way that isn't soothing but necessary, and the distance between survival and disaster is a razor-thin line you're always painfully aware of. The sun rises and with it comes work, because if you don't tend crops, carry water, or repair tools today, there is no magical system delivering your necessities tomorrow. Food doesn't arrive in convenient shipments, and nothing in your home is there simply because you ordered it. Every object is the result of raw materials transformed by someone's hands, often your own, and that physical closeness to survival shapes how you see the world in ways most of us have forgotten. You don't have the luxury of believing that life is stable by default. You know firsthand that it isn't, and hovering above that daily grind, there's something else. Something bigger than your roof beams or the dusty road stretching past your doorway. The sky, a vast, cold, unpolluted dome scattered with stars so sharp and numerous they look almost deliberate. When you look up at night, you're not seeing the vague blur most of us get through the haze of city lights. You're seeing a structured cosmos, a cosmic map, a glittering field of points that appear to move with intention. For ancient people, those lights weren't passive decorations. They were signs, markers, maybe even beings. The idea that the sky was populated with watchers wasn't fanciful, it was basically a logical conclusion. If the king has messengers, and the village has overseers, and every human hierarchy involves someone supervising someone else, why would the cosmos be any different? But let's anchor this to the tone of your life. You're not strolling around pondering metaphysics. You're hauling water from a well, noticing your neighbor's goat has escaped again, worrying that a storm might ruin the barley crop, and quietly hoping the local officials don't show up demanding tribute you can't afford. Empires rise and fall around your region: Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, each one bringing new taxes, new languages, new systems you didn't ask for. You rarely, if ever, see the leaders making these decisions. Their orders just ripple outward until they land on your front door like a reminder that the world is run by people you will never meet. It's like living in an apartment where the landlord keeps changing, but the rent always goes up and no one ever fixes the plumbing. In that kind of world, it becomes strangely comforting to imagine that the universe also has overseers, beings whose job is to manage things from above, beings who exist between the overwhelming power of a god and the fragile daily routines of ordinary humans. The idea of angels, not winged hallmark figures but cosmic agents carrying out assignments, makes emotional sense. It helps you feel that someone is paying attention, even if human rulers aren't. The original listeners of the Book of Enoch weren't imagining angels floating around for aesthetic purposes. They were imagining something closer to inspectors, guardians, celestial administrators whose presence offered reassurance that the universe had structure behind its chaos. But here's where the story takes a turn, and this is the turn that made the Book of Enoch compelling then and still fascinating now. Because according to Enoch, those overseers, those watchers, didn't stay in their lane. They didn't remain distant, neutral auditors. They looked down, got interested, got attached, and ultimately stepped into the human world in a way they were never meant to. You might think of angels today as serene beings who float around looking peaceful, but Enoch's watchers, they were restless, curious, rule-breaking figures who found the drama of human life a little too tempting. And once they crossed that boundary, everything in the story and in the ancient worldview shifted. Imagine living in a time when weapons made of iron suddenly appear, far stronger than the bronze tools your grandparents used. Imagine certain people knowing the stars better than others, able to predict seasons, eclipses, and weather with eerie accuracy. Imagine neighbors whispering about herbs, dyes, and ointments that could change appearances or induce trances. If you don't know the slow, natural development of metallurgical knowledge or medicinal science, these changes feel abrupt, almost supernatural. They create classes of people with power you can't explain, and in an unequal world, unexplained power is always suspicious. When the Book of Enoch says the Watchers descended and taught mankind, it isn't simply explaining where technology came from. It's explaining inequality, corruption, and why some people seem to wield knowledge like a weapon. To an ancient audience, this was not mythic entertainment. This was commentary on their lived reality. The Book of Enoch says, "You're not imagining it, the world is tilted. Someone messed with the foundation ages ago. The people with disproportionate power. They didn't earn it through virtue or skill. They inherited it from beings who played fast and loose with the rules of creation." It's a deeply cynical but strangely comforting worldview. Instead of believing humanity fell apart entirely on its own, Enoch suggests the system was compromised from the top down. In modern terms, it's like discovering the game was hacked before anyone started playing. you've been dealing with the consequences ever since. Imagine now a small courtyard in an ancient settlement, the evening air cooling, the sky slowly turning indigo. People gather, tired but attentive, children leaning on their parents, elders settled onto low stools. Someone begins reciting the story of Enoch, the Watchers, and the forbidden teachings. The audience isn't hearing a detached cosmic myth. They're hearing a story that mirrors their frustrations, a story that explains why strong men dominate the weak, why cities feel like devouring machines, why the world seems misaligned with justice. The Book of Enoch gives language to their suspicion that something is wrong at a cosmic level. It doesn't solve their problems, but it frames them, turning their daily hardships into part of a larger narrative about order and disorder. And as you listen to the story, whether from a courtyard centuries ago or through a screen now, you feel a quiet resonance. The names have changed, the setting has changed, the weapons are no longer bronze or iron, but the feeling that the world doesn't always work the way it should, that remains familiar. The Book of Enoch taps into something universal, the belief that someone was supposed to be watching, someone was supposed to keep things running smoothly, and instead things drifted off course. It's a mythic explanation for a very human frustration. With the stage set and the world framed through the eyes of the people who first told this story, we can now begin moving toward the Watchers themselves, who they were, what they wanted, and how their descent disrupted the fragile order of early humanity. To really understand why the story of the Watchers resonated so deeply with ancient audiences, you have to step into their emotional world, not just their physical one. Their daily lives weren't merely hard in the practical sense, they were hard in the psychological sense too. You lived in a world where your fate often hinged on forces you couldn't see or control. A sudden drought, an invading army, a ruler's whim, even a mysterious illness. Each one could overturn your life without warning. In that kind of environment, the idea that human suffering was the result of a cosmic mistake or rebellion didn't feel far-fetched. It felt painfully reasonable. Because if you're constantly being knocked around by circumstances you didn't cause, it's easier to imagine that someone else, someone higher up in the chain of command, broke the system first. This is part of the reason the Watchers appear not as simple villains, but as almost tragically flawed beings. They weren't evil from the start, at least not in the Enochic imagination. They were supposed to watch, to supervise, to guide creation quietly from above. Their fall wasn't a dramatic Satan versus God showdown like later Christian theology describes. It was more subtle, more human, and in some ways, more relatable. They looked down and saw human life unfolding, and they were drawn in, not necessarily out of malice, but out of desire, curiosity, maybe boredom, maybe ambition. The same cocktail of motives that leads actual human leaders to overstep their boundaries all the time. And that's an important point. When ancient audiences heard that angels fell because they crossed lines they weren't supposed to cross, they didn't hear a cosmic soap opera. They heard something that mirrored the behavior of their own elites. Rule breakers at the top were a familiar sight. Corrupt governors, abusive landlords, priests who leveraged secret knowledge to gain influence, powerful men who used their status to take whatever they wanted. These weren't rare exceptions. They were recurring features of life. So when the Book of Enoch tells you that even the heavenly overseers got swept up in desire and ambition, the story becomes a mirror rather than a fantasy. It reassures you that the chaos of your world isn't a sign of divine indifference. It's the fallout of beings who mismanaged their responsibilities ages ago. In a world where blame often rolled downhill, this story lets you tilt your head upward for once and say, maybe it's not us. Maybe the ones in charge dropped the ball. But there's another emotional layer at play here, and it's one modern readers often overlook. Ancient people lived much closer to the experience of awe, not the Pinterest version of awe that means a nice sunset, but the deep, stomach-dropping feeling of existing in a world full of forces far bigger than you. Storms that cracked the sky open, earthquakes that made the earth feel alive, winds that could erase a whole season's crops in hours. These weren't poetic devices. These were direct experiences. The idea that heavenly beings could cross boundaries wasn't abstract. It was woven into the fabric of a world where boundaries between the natural and supernatural felt thinner. You lived with the constant sense that everything had a spirit, a will, a hidden impetus. So when Enoch says the Watchers descended, the audience didn't picture something gentle or symbolic. They pictured a rupture, a breaking point, a moment when the ceiling of their world cracked open and otherworldly forces stepped through. Now layer on top of that the human tendency to mythologize trauma. When something catastrophic happens, a devastating war, a famine, a societal collapse, people naturally create stories that help them make emotional sense of the chaos. These stories don't have to be strictly factual to serve their purpose. They offer structure, pattern, accountability. The Book of Enoch does exactly that. It says the world became corrupted because divine beings abandoned their roles and introduced knowledge and violence that humanity wasn't ready for. It shifts the origin of suffering from because humans are terrible to because something interfered with the natural order. And that is, ironically, a gentler worldview. It says your suffering is part of a larger narrative, not a personal or collective failure. This is why the Watchers aren't described as demons at first. They're described almost like rogue officials, middle managers who are supposed to keep things on track but instead decided to pursue their own interests. They teach forbidden knowledge not because they want to destroy humanity, but because they want to share power, form bonds, or indulge their own impulses. It's messy, it's misguided, and it's very recognizable. In a world where you could be punished for breaking rules even when you didn't understand them, there was something darkly comforting about imagining the powerful making mistakes too. If even the angels were flawed, then at least the cosmic deck wasn't stacked entirely against you because of your own shortcomings. And here's where another cynically human detail slips in. The Watchers don't just passively fall, they organize their rebellion. Enoch describes a moment when one angel, usually named Semyaza, gathers the others and essentially says, if we're going to do this, we need to all agree, so none of us ends up taking the blame alone. This, again, is painfully familiar. Anyone who has ever worked under a questionable leader or watched a group of people justify a bad decision together knows the dynamic. It's not a grand ideological revolt. It's a bunch of individuals persuading each other that if everyone jumps at the same time, no one can be singled out. It's almost bureaucratic in its logic, which is exactly what makes it feel real. Now imagine how an ancient listener hears this. They're living in a society where the decisions of elites often seem arbitrary, poorly thought out, or driven by desires the common people can't influence. They've seen local officials make bad choices, foreign rulers impose destructive policies, and priests form alliances that benefit themselves more than the community. When they hear that the angels themselves made a pact to break divine law, the story doesn't feel like fantasy. It feels like a cosmic version of the corruption they see every day. The heavens in this narrative are not an untouched realm of moral perfection. They're a reflection of the same messy dynamics that shape human life. The difference is that when heavenly beings make mistakes, the consequences shake the world permanently. But the Watcher's fall isn't just about moral failure. It's also about the allure of forbidden knowledge. This is one of the most intriguing elements of the Book of Enoch. The Watchers teach humans metallurgy, cosmetics, enchantments, weapon crafting, and the interpretation of celestial signs. To modern ears, these may sound like random categories, but to ancient listeners, each one represented a form of power that could dramatically reshape society. Metal weapons changed warfare. Cosmetics changed social dynamics and perceptions of beauty. Divination changed political authority. Knowledge itself becomes a destabilizing force, and Enoch frames that force as something imported, not organically developed. This isn't merely a story about sin, it's a story about uneven access to knowledge and the consequences of technology arriving faster than a society can handle. And again, if you're living in a small village, watching elites wield tools and knowledge you don't understand, this explanation hits home. The unevenness of power feels cosmic in scale. So the story tells you, yes, the scales are uneven, but not because you're inferior. They were tipped before you were born. It's the ancient world's version of realizing the system was rigged long before you entered it. All of this, the cosmic bureaucracy, the moral failure of overseers, the introduction of premature knowledge, the emotional need to explain suffering, combines to create a worldview where fallen angels aren't just mythic figures. They're metaphors for everything that feels broken about human life. They're a narrative container for inequality, injustice, and the sense that the world could have been better if someone had just followed the rules at the top. And with that emotional groundwork laid, the stage is now set for the next part of the story. The Watchers descending fully into the world, forming bonds with humanity, and setting in motion the events that will eventually reshape the earth itself. To understand the impact of the Watchers' descent, you have to picture the human world they supposedly stepped into, not as a vague landscape of ancient people doing ancient things, but as a living, breathing place with its own textures, sounds, fears, and rhythms. The Book of Enoch never pauses to explain what humanity looked like at this moment, because its original listeners already knew. The story wasn't designed for people with smartphones and electric lighting. It was designed for people whose entire universe could fit comfortably inside the radius of a day's walk. Imagine the human world from above, not from a satellite's perspective, but from a height just high enough to see the land in small patches. You would see scattered settlements made of mud bricks, stone, or timber, small clusters of structures huddling near water sources, narrow footpaths cut through fields of barley and wheat, not in neat rectangles like modern farms, but in irregular shapes shaped by topography and habit. Smoke rising from cooking fires curls upward in thin, pale strands, fading into the evening sky. Domesticated animals wander close to their owners: goats, sheep, donkeys, maybe a few cattle if the household is lucky. There is no real sense of privacy. Anything you do, from grinding grain to arguing with family to slaughtering an animal for food, happens within earshot of your neighbors. Life is communal, not by aesthetic preference, but because survival requires it. If the Watchers truly descended into this world, they entered a society where labor was constant and largely unchanging. Most people lived their entire lives repeating the same motions: planting, harvesting, grinding, carrying, kneading, building, repairing, with almost no variation. These tasks were not romantic. They were exhausting, repetitive, and often dangerous in small, mundane ways. A deep cut, a broken bone, an infection from contaminated water. Any of these could become life-threatening when medical knowledge consisted mostly of herbal treatments and prayer. People lived close to the earth, close to their animals, and close to each other, for better and worse. And despite what modern imagination might tell you, ancient people weren't sitting around waiting for stories of angels and giants to brighten their evenings. They had their own religious frameworks, local gods, ancestral traditions, rituals passed down through generations. Their world was already full of unseen forces. Spirits of rivers, mountains, winds, and storms were as real as neighbors. You could anger them, appease them, bargain with them. Daily life had its own rhythm of offerings, festivals, and rites. So when the story of the Watchers began circulating, it didn't land in an empty, imaginative space. It slipped into a worldview already thick with divine presence, cosmic order, and sacred boundaries. That's part of what made the Watchers' story unsettling. These beings weren't just another category of spirit or god. They were outsiders, powerful, luminous, yet oddly fallible. They weren't supposed to be involved in human affairs, certainly not in intimate ones. So the idea of them descending, approaching humans, interacting with them, and teaching them hidden knowledge represented a major breach in the cosmological order. It wasn't just shocking, it was destabilizing. It was like learning that the people who write the rules of your society are secretly ignoring them behind closed doors, or that the supervisor responsible for maintaining order in your workplace is quietly causing chaos. The discomfort hits on multiple levels. But let's step deeper into the human world they entered, a world of sound, texture, and mood. The crackle of firewood at dusk, the grinding rumble of stone mills as women crush grain into flour, the soft thud of sandals on packed earth, the bleating of goats, the rustling of wind over fields, and the distant rumble of thunder from mountains you rarely visit but always fear. Nights are colder than you expect. Darkness is complete. When the sun goes down, your world shrinks dramatically. The shadows creep closer. Stars fill the sky in patterns you've memorized since childhood. There's no such thing as background noise, no steady hum of electricity. Every sound matters. Every flicker of movement in the dark feels meaningful. This is the world the Watchers supposedly looked down upon and chose to enter. The Book of Enoch says they descended on Mount Hermon, a mountain range straddling modern Syria and Lebanon. But don't think of it as a symbolic location. For the people who told this story, Hermon was a real, imposing, snow-covered giant dominating the landscape, a place of storms, a place where clouds gathered and thunder cracked the sky open, a place where the divine felt close. Mountains in ancient thought were cosmic border zones, ladders between earth and heaven, places where the human and divine could briefly overlap. So, when the Watchers descend onto Hermon, it is not a random choice. It is a cosmic breach happening at the edge of the world, where people already half expected something supernatural to appear. Now imagine the Watchers through the eyes of ancient people, not glowing Renaissance angels, not delicate winged beings with soft curls and halos, but terrifyingly beautiful figures, tall, radiant, and imposing, beings made of light or fire or something too refined to belong to the earth. They are not human, and yet they take human form. They walk, they speak, they look at you as if you are both familiar and fragile. They carry secrets etched into their very being. They radiate knowledge the way a fire radiates heat. But here is where things become deeply human again. According to Enoch, The Watchers don't descend merely to observe. They descend because they saw human women and were captivated. And once again, ancient listeners didn't hear this the way modern readers might. They didn't hear angels fell in love with humans. They heard those with power crossed a boundary they were never supposed to cross. The Watcher's attraction wasn't framed as romance. It was framed as transgression, a violation of cosmic order driven by desire. The idea that beings of immense power could be swayed by something as ordinary as beauty was both unsettling and strangely relatable. It made the divine feel flawed in a way humans recognized instantly. And it wasn't just desire, it was knowledge. The Watchers brought hidden teachings, metallurgy, enchantments, herbal lore, astrology, and unveiled them to humanity long before people were ready to wield such knowledge responsibly. It's the mythic version of handing a toddler a box of knives and saying, "Have fun experimenting," or giving someone the recipe for fire bombs before they've even figured out how to make a stable cooking fire. The consequences were predictable. Violence escalated, inequality exploded. People gained power faster than they developed the wisdom or moral frameworks to handle it. Once again, ancient listeners didn't hear this as symbolic. They saw it reflected in their own world, weapons getting deadlier, priests using arcane knowledge to control communities, warriors who seemed invincible, rulers who claimed authority based on secret astronomical insights. The world was changing, and not always for the better. The Watchers' arrival, in the eyes of ancient people, explained the spiritual and moral imbalance they saw all around them. Why did some people have power so far beyond ordinary experience? Why did violence seem to escalate across generations? Why did certain individuals look like they were playing by a different set of rules? Enoch's story answered all of these questions at once, because someone interfered, because the order of the world was disrupted by beings who weren't supposed to meddle, because humanity inherited the fallout of a cosmic misstep, a divine scandal with generational consequences. This is the emotional and cultural world into which the Watchers descended, a world ready to believe that suffering wasn't random, that imbalance had a cause, and that somewhere high above, someone was responsible. And with this landscape understood, we're now ready to approach one of the most striking ideas in the entire book of Enoch, the creation of the Nephilim, the giants born from the union of Watchers and humans. If the descent of the Watchers was a cosmic breach, then the arrival of the Nephilim was the shockwave that followed. The Book of Enoch describes them almost casually, as if the birth of giants from the union of angels and humans is simply the next predictable thing that happens when celestial beings ignore the chain of command. But for ancient listeners, this wasn't just an interesting plot development. It was an explanation for something they already believed, that somewhere in the distant past, the world had been home to beings who were larger, stronger, and far more destructive than ordinary humans. The ruins scattered across the landscape, the stories of legendary warriors, the memory of old conflicts that no one fully understood anymore. All of these fed into the sense that the ancient world had once been populated by beings who were more than human, yet not quite divine. The Nephilim in the Enochic imagination weren't just tall people. They were embodiments of imbalance. They were what happens when two realms that were never meant to intersect suddenly collide. They were excess made flesh, excess strength, excess appetite, excess violence, and their very existence was proof that the world had slipped dramatically out of order. If you imagine cosmic creation as a delicate instrument finely calibrated to maintain harmony, then the Nephilim are what happens when someone starts pressing the wrong buttons just to see what will happen. They're the glitch in the system, the unintended byproduct of a decision made far above the human pay grade. But let's make this less abstract. Imagine being an ordinary person living in a small settlement, hearing stories from older relatives about beings who towered over humans, consumed resources at impossible rates, and treated the world like a playground built for their amusement. You don't need perfect historical accuracy to understand the emotional truth behind these stories. Ancient people lived close to the earth, close to danger, close to the fragile boundary between survival and collapse. When something went catastrophically wrong, a village destroyed, land overtaken, crops trampled, people scattered, it left scars that outlasted memory. And when you don't know which army or natural disaster caused the devastation, the mind fills in the rest. It creates a figure large enough, powerful enough, monstrous enough to justify the scale of the damage. That's the Nephilim. They are the mythic scale adjustment that makes human suffering make sense. Enoch describes them as beings who consumed all the acquisitions of men, a poetic way of saying they ate everything. They devoured crops, livestock, and eventually, according to the text, even human beings. Now, modern listeners might instinctively hear that as melodramatic exaggeration, but for ancient people, this was a deeply relatable metaphor for the experience of living under predatory ruling classes or invading armies. When a foreign power swept through your land, they didn't politely take a sample of your grain. They emptied your storage jars, seized your livestock, conscripted your young men, demanded tribute, and left you poorer than before. To the average person, these forces were effectively giant. They were larger-than-life powers that consumed the world and left nothing behind. So when Enoch says the Nephilim devoured everything, ancient audiences nodded. Yes, they thought, that sounds familiar. This wasn't myth for entertainment. It was myth as social commentary. Myth that explained the violence of their world in cosmic terms. But the Nephilim weren't only symbols of external oppression. They represented internal corruption too. When the Watchers taught humans forbidden knowledge, weapon making, sorcery, cosmetics, astrology, they unleashed forces that changed society. Suddenly, certain individuals had access to tools and knowledge that could elevate them above everyone else. They became stronger, richer, more influential. And in a world where power was rarely distributed evenly, that concentrated power often turned predatory. The story of the Nephilim isn't just about big physical bodies. It's about the monstrous consequences of unequal knowledge, the dangers of power acquired without wisdom, and the way society can be warped by those who wield such power without restraint. It's worth remembering that the Book of Enoch wasn't created in a vacuum. It emerged in a period where people lived under oppressive empires, watched local rulers collaborate with foreign powers, and saw their own traditions threatened by outside influences. The Nephilim narrative, in this light, becomes a way of explaining why certain individuals, kings, warriors, tyrants, seem to operate outside the bounds of normal humanity. They're too strong, too ruthless, too indifferent to suffering. They take and take until nothing is left, and the only explanation that makes emotional sense is that they descend from something not entirely human. And while modern readers might focus on the supernatural biology of angels fathering giants, ancient audiences were far more concerned with the moral and social implications. The Nephilim were walking evidence that the world had become fundamentally misaligned. They were living proof that the natural order had been sabotaged long ago. Their size and violence weren't just physical traits, they were symptoms of a world that had absorbed too much celestial interference, a world where power had entered the human realm in the wrong way, at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons. But Enoch goes further. He describes the Nephilim not just as a threat to humans, but as a threat to creation itself. Their presence corrupts the earth, their violence fills the world with bloodshed, their appetites destabilize the ecological balance. In this worldview, the Nephilim are not simply big villains, they are existential hazards, distortions that threaten the structural integrity of the world. The natural world becomes hostile not because God designed it that way, but because beings from outside the natural world disrupted its foundation. If you've ever wondered why ancient people gravitated toward narratives of cosmic catastrophe, floods, fires, earthquakes, it's because they lived close enough to the land to feel its instability. A bad year wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. A failed harvest could lead to famine. A drought could reshape entire societies. The idea that the Nephilim played a role in amplifying ecological collapse made perfect sense. And here's where we must linger on something subtle but important. The Nephilim are not immortal. They are powerful, but they are doomed. Their existence is temporary, unsustainable. They are beings born of imbalance, and imbalance can't last. In many ancient texts, including Enoch, the Nephilim eventually turn on each other. Their strength becomes their downfall. Their aggression spirals inward. Their existence burns itself out like a destructive fire. This idea that unchecked power ultimately collapses under its own weight would have resonated deeply with people who watched empires rise and fall around them. It's a moral arc written not in idealistic terms but in the practical rhythms of history. Nothing monstrous lasts forever, not even giants. The story of the Nephilim also prepares the ground for one of the most dramatic elements of the Enochic narrative, the Great Judgment, the cleansing of the earth, the reset that eventually leads to the flood. But that part of the story is beyond chapter 1's scope. For now, we're focused on the emotional and social landscape that made the Nephilim meaningful. They were avatars of disruption, symbols of everything that felt wrong with the world, and powerful reminders that the consequences of cosmic rebellion didn't stop in the heavens. They were felt in the soil, in the economy, in the social hierarchy, in the very ecology of human life. By the time the audience finished hearing this part of the story, they weren't thinking of the Nephilim as fantasy creatures. They were thinking of them as the mythic reflection of their own suffering, too big, too hungry, too aggressive, too powerful. And this set the stage for everything that follows in the book of Enoch. The Watchers didn't just fall. They broke the world, and the giants were the evidence. With this final piece of chapter 1 in place, we're now ready to step into chapter 2, where Enoch himself enters the story, and the Watcher's fate takes shape. Chapter 2. Enoch steps forward, witness to the Watcher's judgment. Before Enoch becomes the central figure of this strange cosmic drama, he appears in the book of Genesis almost like a footnote, a name tucked into a genealogy, a flicker of a life among many others. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more because God took him. That's the whole entry. No battles, no miracles, no parables, no speeches. Just a quiet disappearance that leaves more questions than answers. And ancient imaginations, being what they are, could not leave a mystery like that alone. If someone walked with God and then vanished, surely there had to be more to the story. Surely there was an explanation, a purpose, a hidden role waiting to be uncovered. And in the book of Enoch, that missing story blooms into a full narrative, not of a warrior or a king or a prophet shouting warnings in crowded streets, but of a surprisingly calm, observant man chosen to witness the consequences of the Watcher's rebellion firsthand. In many ways, Enoch becomes the ancient world's version of the unlikely protagonist, the person who wasn't a ruler, wasn't a soldier, wasn't particularly exceptional in the eyes of the world, yet somehow ends up at the center of cosmic events. This is a pattern that repeats across many cultures. The quiet person, the one living an ordinary life, gets swept into a role far beyond anything they expected. But Enoch's version isn't dramatic or action-oriented. He doesn't charge into battles or overthrow tyrants. Instead, he becomes a kind of celestial reporter, someone designated to observe, record, and explain the fallout of the Watcher's decisions. That's one of the most fascinating elements of the Book of Enoch. It doesn't choose a hero who solves the crisis. It chooses a witness, someone whose job is simply to understand, someone who is entrusted with knowledge rather than tasked with restoring order personally. And in a world where people often felt powerless under the weight of empires and unpredictable forces, that role would have resonated deeply. Most people weren't leaders. Most weren't warriors. Most couldn't change the world even if they wanted to. But many could recognize the value of understanding the world, of seeing clearly, of making sense of things. Enoch becomes the embodiment of that quiet yearning for clarity. But before Enoch receives his visions, before he writes anything down, before the angels seek him out, we have to imagine him as his original audience did, as a man living in the same fragile, unpredictable world we explored in Chapter 1, a world of small settlements clustered near water, of back-breaking labor, of social structures built on survival rather than ambition, a world where nighttime truly meant darkness, where storms were terrifying, where the stars felt close enough to touch, a world where people didn't separate the natural from the supernatural the way we do today. Everything flowed together, weather, illness, dreams, politics, stars, divine beings, all part of one connected reality. To live in such a world was to constantly interpret signs, to look for meaning, to wonder what larger forces governed the small, stumbling path of human life. So when Enoch begins receiving messages, visions, or revelations, depending on how literally you read the text, he does so as someone who already believes the cosmos is alive with intention. Someone who expects the divine to intervene, not because he is special, but because that's what the world feels like. And yet, the story doesn't begin with a dramatic visitation. It begins with a sense of rising imbalance, a sense that the world is slipping out of alignment. The Watcher's descent, their forbidden teachings, the emergence of the Nephilim. These events create a kind of cosmic disturbance that ripples into human life. And Enoch, unlike most people, becomes aware of these disturbances not as rumors or fragments of stories, but as something deeper, something almost calling to him. You can imagine Enoch as someone who pays attention in a world where most people are too busy surviving to notice the subtle shifts around them. He's the one who looks up at the stars not just to check the weather, but to sense whether something has changed. He's the one who listens to strange winds, watches patterns of behavior, notices the increasing violence, the growing despair, the sense of heaviness in the earth itself. He lives in a time when the Nephilim are said to dominate the land, when resources dwindle, when people fear events they don't understand. He sees the effects of the Watcher's influence, the new weapons, the new forms of manipulation, the new inequalities, and he understands that something is fundamentally off. He doesn't have the arrogance to assume he can fix it, but he has the humility to acknowledge the magnitude of what's happening. This is the Enoch that ancient listeners would have recognized. A perceptive man, not a powerful one. Someone who notices the truth others avoid. Someone who senses the world groaning under the weight of interference. Someone whose quiet observation makes him the perfect candidate to receive divine insight. And this is where the story takes its next gentle, strange turn. According to the Book of Enoch, angels approach him, not the watchers, but loyal messengers sent from the higher realms. They come not as monsters or giants, but as beings of clarity, representatives of order stepping into a world marred by disorder. And they don't command Enoch to take up arms or rally people. They don't warn him to flee. They simply tell him something astonishing, that he has been chosen to act as a bridge between heaven and earth, to record what has happened, to explain what is coming, and to speak on behalf of humanity. Enoch's role is not to fix the situation, but to illuminate it. His purpose is understanding, not action. In many ways, this is the quietest form of heroism. He becomes the one who bears witness when no one else can. He steps into a realm no ordinary human is allowed to see, not to conquer it, but to comprehend it. And for ancient audiences, this must have felt deeply comforting. Not everyone can be a warrior. Not everyone can be a leader, but everyone can strive to understand the world, to make sense of suffering, to look for meaning in chaos. Enoch becomes the avatar of that universal human impulse. The angels tell him that the Watchers have broken sacred boundaries, that their descent has corrupted the earth, that their offspring, the Nephilim, have distorted the natural order, and that the world is reaching a breaking point. Enoch listens. He doesn't resist, doesn't argue, doesn't claim unworthiness. He simply absorbs the weight of this revelation, and that acceptance, that willingness to learn rather than fight, is precisely what makes him worthy of the task. In a world built on hierarchies and force, Enoch's power comes from clarity, and clarity is a rare commodity in ancient life. When famine struck, people blamed spirits or kings or the weather. When wars erupted, people blamed neighboring tribes or the will of the gods. When suffering overwhelmed communities, people accepted it as fate. But Enoch is asked to see beyond surface explanations, to trace the roots of disorder back to cosmic origins. He becomes the historian of heaven's mistakes, the narrator of a divine scandal, the voice that explains why the world feels so broken. And what follows is even stranger. Enoch is invited to witness the fate of the Watchers themselves, their grief, their confusion, their desperate attempts to negotiate with heaven. But we're not there yet. For now, we stay with this moment. Enoch, chosen not for strength, but for perception. A quiet man entrusted with a cosmic truth. This is where the Book of Enoch begins to shift from a myth of rebellion to a story of understanding. And as chapter 2 unfolds, Enoch's role becomes clearer. He is the one who sees what others cannot. He is the one who listens to the sorrow of angels and the judgment of heaven. He is the one who translates cosmic events into human language. One of the most surprising elements of the Book of Enoch, and one that ancient listeners would have found both unsettling and strangely satisfying, is that the Watchers regret what they've done. This isn't a story where divine beings boldly rebel and then revel in their new identities as cosmic outlaws. It's a story in which powerful beings make a series of reckless choices and then realize, far too late, that they have set events in motion they cannot control, and that regret is not quiet or dignified. It is panicked. It is desperate. It is the regret of beings who finally understand the weight of consequences, not as a philosophical idea, but as something bearing down on them with unstoppable force. To appreciate this, we need to imagine the Watchers not as villains, but as administrators who stepped outside their job description. They weren't originally designed for rebellion. They weren't scheming to overthrow heaven or corrupt creation. They were simply fascinated, drawn in by the appeal of human life, tempted by desire, and eager to share their knowledge. In other words, their motives were messy in the same way human motives are messy. And like most people who make poor decisions from a combination of curiosity and impulse, they didn't fully consider the long-term implications. They saw beauty, opportunity, novelty, and not the catastrophic chain reaction that would follow. But now, after the birth of the Nephilim, after the earth has been overwhelmed by violence, after human society begins to fracture under the weight of these unnatural beings, the Watchers finally understand that they have created something irreversible. They cannot undo the knowledge they shared. They cannot take back the offspring they produced. They cannot restore the innocence of the world before their arrival. And in that recognition, they do something profoundly human. They seek help. They seek forgiveness. They seek mediation. And this is where Enoch enters the story not just as an observer, but as an intercessor. The book of Enoch describes the Watchers turning to Enoch with a kind of frantic hope. They ask him to speak to God on their behalf. They ask him to write a petition, a formal request for mercy. Imagine that for a moment. These powerful, radiant beings who descended with confidence and desire are now reduced to pleading with a human being to serve as their lawyer. And Enoch, ordinary and fragile by comparison, becomes the one who carries their words upward. It's a moment that flips the cosmic hierarchy on its head, reinforcing one of the text's most haunting themes. Knowledge without wisdom leads to humiliation. Power without restraint leads to collapse. But why Enoch? Why not another angel? Why not approach heaven directly? The text hints at something subtle, that the Watchers have already stepped so far out of bounds that they no longer have the right to speak for themselves. Their channels of communication are compromised. Their authority has been revoked. They need someone untouched by their rebellion to bridge the gap. And Enoch, with his reputation for walking with God and his keen awareness of the world's imbalance, becomes the perfect intermediary. Ancient listeners would have recognized the emotional logic instantly. This is the dynamic of someone who has broken a sacred agreement and now must rely on a third party to plead their case. It's the moral equivalent of a wayward official asking a respected elder to speak on his behalf. There is fear, shame, confusion, and desperation all woven into the request. And Enoch, who might understandably be terrified or resentful, instead responds with calm acceptance. He agrees to write their petition. He listens to their confessions. He becomes their voice. But the Book of Enoch doesn't romanticize this role. It portrays Enoch as someone carrying a heavy burden. Imagine being asked to advocate for beings who have fundamentally altered the world you live in. Imagine watching the violence of the Nephilim, witnessing the suffering of your people, and then being asked to express sympathy for the ones who caused it all. It's a morally complicated task, and the text acknowledges this complexity through Enoch's quiet demeanor. He does not condemn the Watchers outright, but he also does not comfort them. He simply does what is asked of him, as if he understands that his role is not to judge, but to clarify. So Enoch writes the petition. He documents the Watcher's plea for forgiveness, their remorse, their recognition of error, and then he delivers it, not verbally, but by ascending into the realm of the divine through vision or revelation. Whether he physically travels upward or is transported through a dreamlike state, the text doesn't specify, because the point isn't the mechanics. The point is the access. Enoch enters the palace of heaven, the seat of cosmic authority, and presents the Watcher's desperate request. And heaven's response is not ambiguous. It is firm. It is final. It is absolute. The Watchers will not be forgiven. This judgment is one of the most striking moments in the book, and not because it is harsh, but because it is delivered with a kind of calm inevitability. The message Enoch receives is not angry or wrathful. It is simply a statement of reality. The Watchers crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Their petitions are denied. Their fate is sealed. They will witness the destruction of their offspring. They will lose their place in the cosmic hierarchy. They will face a punishment tailored not to their malice, but to their failure of duty, confinement, separation, and the slow erosion of their influence. To ancient listeners, this would have been deeply satisfying, not because they wanted to see the Watchers destroyed, but because it affirmed a principle they rarely saw honored in real life: accountability for the powerful. In the human world, rulers could act with impunity. Warriors could take what they wanted. Priests could manipulate rituals for personal gain. But in heaven, at least in the imagination of the Book of Enoch, even angels are held responsible for their actions. Even celestial beings face consequences when they misuse power. It's a kind of cosmic justice that mirrors the longing of every oppressed society, the hope that no one, not even the highest, is above the law. And the Watcher's reaction to this judgment intensifies the emotional depth of the story. They do not respond with anger or rebellion. They respond with grief. The text describes them weeping, trembling, incapable of standing before the clarity of the divine presence. These beings who once appeared powerful and alluring are now reduced to tears, overwhelmed by the certainty of their fate. It's not their punishment that is emphasized, but their sorrow, and ancient listeners would have recognized this as a moral lesson. The consequences of reckless desire are not heroic, not dramatic, not empowering. They are tragic. Enoch returns to the Watchers with the message. Imagine the silence that follows. The Watchers who once descended with boldness now sit in despair, their hopes extinguished, their future sealed. The cosmic imbalance they created continues to ripple outward, and they cannot stop it. Enoch, standing before them, becomes the embodiment of unwelcome truth, and yet he does not speak with condemnation. He simply relays what he has learned. His role, once again, is not to punish but to illuminate. This moment marks a turning point in the narrative. The Watcher's rebellion is no longer a story of seduction and forbidden knowledge. It becomes a story of sorrow and inevitability. Their fate is fixed. The world must now reckon with the consequences of their actions. And Enoch, having stepped into his role as intermediary, is about to step into an even deeper role, that of cosmic traveler, visionary, and chronicler of judgment. Once Enoch delivers the Watcher's petition and receives the divine response, the story shifts. It opens upward. The narrative, which until now has focused on the earth, on corruption, giants, suffering, imbalance, suddenly turns toward the sky. Enoch is invited into realms no human is ever supposed to enter, and in the process, the Book of Enoch does something extraordinary. It constructs one of the earliest surviving visions of heaven as an actual place, not an abstract concept, not a vague realm of light, a location, a structure. a cosmic government complex with layers, chambers, thresholds, and inhabitants. And Enoch, this quiet figure from an unremarkable village, becomes the first to walk through it. For ancient listeners, this wasn't just entertaining metaphysics. It was a profound reorientation of perspective. Imagine living your whole life under the weight of unpredictable rulers, inconsistent justice, and an often chaotic world. Then imagine hearing a story that reveals the universe as orderly on a higher level, governed by laws that even angels cannot escape. The ascent of Enoch isn't just a mystical event. It's reassurance that beyond the mess of human life, beyond the havoc caused by the Watchers, there is a structure that still holds. Justice, clarity, and meaning haven't been erased. They're simply located above the confusion, not within it. In the Book of Enoch, this ascent doesn't begin with bright chariots or dramatic theatrics. It begins with an invitation. As the Watchers collapse into grief and panic, Enoch's role expands. He becomes not just their messenger, but a student, a witness being brought into the inner workings of the cosmos to understand what is coming next. His journey upward is described in language that blends awe with calm detachment. It's not frightening exactly. It's more like being ushered into a government building you never knew existed, one that has been making decisions about your world since long before you were born. Enoch describes being carried by wind, light, or some kind of divine force. The text is deliberately ambiguous because the point isn't the transportation method, but the transition itself. He moves from the realm of humans to the realm of angels, crossing boundaries that the Watchers shattered foolishly, but that Enoch crosses with permission. This distinction matters. Ancient listeners would have understood that boundaries are sacred. Crossing them improperly leads to disaster, but crossing them under the guidance of the divine leads to revelation. Enoch's ascent is the mirror image of the Watchers' descent. Where they broke order, he restores it through understanding. As he rises, the world below fades, the familiar textures of soil and stone, the sounds of animals and labor, the weight of dust and heat, all of it drops away. Enoch enters a space beyond weather, beyond seasons, beyond pain, and the first heavenly realm he describes is not a paradise but something more austere, immense, bright, cold, not cold in temperature, but cold in the sense of clarity, a place where nothing is hidden, nothing softened. Ancient people imagined the heavens as places of unbearable radiance, not cozy comfort. Light meant truth, not warmth. And in Enoch's description, the intensity of this light is overwhelming. It strips away ambiguity. It reveals everything. In this first realm, Enoch encounters beings who appear nothing like the Watchers. The Watchers, as earthbound transgressors, are described in forms humans can comprehend, tall, luminous, attractively strange. But the angels who govern the higher realms are different. They are fierce, immense, and absolutely focused on their duties. They do not waver, do not question, do not become entangled in human affairs. They represent the cosmic order the Watchers failed to uphold, and their presence would have been utterly humbling to ancient listeners. These are not comforting guardian figures. They are the celestial equivalent of seasoned administrators who have spent eternity maintaining a system too complex for human minds to grasp. Enoch moves through this realm and into another, and then another. Each layer reveals a different aspect of divine order. Rooms of judgment, chambers filled with records, places where cosmic forces are stored or released. To modern ears, this might sound metaphorical, but to ancient audiences, it would have felt startlingly concrete. They lived in societies where every major institution had a physical space: temples, courts, archives, treasuries, storehouses. Cosmic order, therefore, must also have architecture. If there is judgment, there must be a hall where it is pronounced. If there are records of deeds, there must be a place where they are kept. The heavens, in Enoch's account, operate like a perfectly functioning kingdom with no corruption, no confusion, and no incompetence. Everything the human world lacks. One of the most striking elements of Enoch's ascent is the Hall of Judgment. He describes it as a place of blazing fire, pillars of flame, and a throne so radiant that no human could look at it directly. But the tone isn't frightening. It's awestruck. The flames are not destructive but clarifying. Everything that enters this hall is illuminated and nothing can hide. The flames are truth itself, embodying the idea that knowledge in heaven is not distorted by desire or fear. And the throne, the center of all authority, is presented as a source of stability rather than domination. It is impossible to approach without permission, not because it is wrathful, but because its purity is absolute. Now imagine how this sounded to someone living under the rule of inconsistent kings. Human rulers made decisions based on whim, greed, or pressure. But in the heavenly court, Enoch sees decisions emerge from a place of perfect knowledge. There is no bribery, no favoritism, no confusion. The contrast would have been comforting beyond measure. Heaven is not chaotic. Heaven is not uncertain. Heaven is not subject to the same dysfunctions that plague human life. And in that structured realm, the Watcher's actions appear even more foolish. They walked away from this order to meddle in a world they were never meant to alter. Enoch also encounters angels who specialize in maintaining the balance of the natural world. Some govern the stars, ensuring their paths remain steady. Some oversee the wind, the seasons, the waters. Some control celestial forces that would be catastrophic if released improperly. For ancient listeners, this was not abstract theology. It was an explanation for why the world seemed stable even when human societies were not. If the rains came on time, if the seasons shifted predictably, it was because these angels ensured it. If they occasionally did not, then something had disturbed the balance. And in the context of the Book of Enoch, that disturbance was the Watcher's rebellion. It's worth noting that Enoch doesn't respond to these revelations with terror. He responds with quiet acceptance. He observes, he records, he understands. This calm demeanor is one of the reasons he becomes such a compelling figure. He is the human who doesn't try to exceed his role. He doesn't ask for power, demand signs, or attempt to negotiate outcomes. He simply witnesses. And for an ancient audience tired of leaders who overreached, Enoch's restraint would have felt refreshing. The deeper Enoch travels, the more the architecture of heaven reveals itself as a counterpoint to the chaos on earth. Where the human world is fragile, the heavens are stable. Where human leaders are unpredictable, celestial beings are unwavering. Where the Watchers cause disorder, the higher angels enforce harmony, and Enoch, standing between these realms, becomes the conduit for a message that will reshape humanity's understanding of the crisis unfolding below. All of this sets the stage for the next major development, Enoch's direct encounter with the consequences of cosmic judgment and the revealing of what will happen to the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the world itself. By the time Enoch reaches the deepest chambers of heaven, the narrative shifts again. The ascent has shown him the architecture of the cosmos, the order that lies above disorder, the calm machinery quietly holding creation together. But now Enoch is brought to witness something more specific, something heavier, the judgment of the Watchers and the destiny of the world reshaped by their actions. The Book of Enoch does not rush this moment. It unfolds with the slow, solemn weight of inevitability. the way a storm gathers on the horizon long before the first raindrop falls. And Enoch, the quiet witness, becomes the first human to understand the true scale of what is coming. In the heavenly court, Enoch learns that the consequences for the Watchers have already been decided. The divine decision is not a reaction made in haste or anger, but a response made in perfect clarity. The Watchers, once appointed as guardians, crossed boundaries they were never meant to cross, abandoned their roles, misused their authority, and introduced knowledge that destabilized the human world. Their punishment is not framed as revenge, it is framed as a restoration of balance. They broke order. Now order must correct itself, and Enoch, standing before the throne, absorbs this truth not with outrage, but with the calm recognition of someone who has already seen the chaos below. The first revelation he receives is that the Watchers will be confined, not destroyed, not erased, but bound, held in a state of suspension until the final judgment. It's a punishment tailored to their crime. They left their appointed station, so now they will lose freedom of movement entirely. They took advantage of their position to intervene where they should not, so now they will be immobilized, silenced, rendered unable to influence the world further. Ancient listeners would have recognized the poetic symmetry immediately. In a world where elites often acted without consequences, the idea of perfect cosmic accountability was profoundly reassuring. But the Watcher's fate is only part of the picture. Enoch is also shown what will happen to their offspring, the Nephilim. And here the judgment takes on a different tone. The Nephilim, in the Enochic worldview, are beings of excess, physically powerful, morally unrestrained, embodiments of imbalance. They devour resources, dominate humans, and destabilize the earth. They are not blamed for their own creation, but they are recognized as a danger to the world, and so their fate is sealed as well. They will perish, their bodies will fall, and their spirits. This is where the text becomes unexpectedly subtle. Their spirits will continue in a sort of disembodied unrest, the source of many later associations with wandering or malevolent forces. To ancient listeners, this explanation filled a gap in understanding. Why did violence feel so persistent? Why did certain places feel haunted? Why did misfortune linger long after a conflict ended? The idea that the spirits of giants still moved through the world gave shape to intangible fears. It offered a cosmological reason for the feeling that some wounds, whether social or personal, never fully healed. And in true Enochic fashion, the narrative frames this not as superstition, but as a structural consequence. Imbalance produces remnants. Disorder leaves echoes. But Enoch's visions go further. He is shown the flood, not the local flood of a river valley, but the mythic flood, the cleansing that resets the world. And this revelation is delivered with the same calm detachment as every other part of his journey. There is no dramatic depiction of crashing waves or screaming crowds. The emphasis is not on spectacle, but on restoration. The world must be washed of the imbalance created by the Watcher's rebellion. It's not a punishment aimed at humanity, but a rebalancing intended to restore harmony to creation. The violence of the flood is framed as the necessary counterweight to the violence of the Nephilim. For ancient audiences who had lived through their share of natural disasters, this framing mattered. Floods, droughts, earthquakes, they all struck with terrifying indifference. But in the Book of Enoch, catastrophe is not random. It is purposeful. It has meaning. It has a narrative. And while that may not make the suffering easier, it gives the suffering context. The world isn't collapsing. It's recalibrating. Enoch also learns that humanity is not being abandoned. Hidden within the judgment is a thread of mercy. The destruction is not total. A remnant will survive. Life will continue. Order will re-emerge from the waters. And this is where Enoch's role becomes even more important. He is tasked with returning to the human realm to announce what he has learned, to explain the cosmic reasons behind the coming upheaval, to prepare at least some minds for what is ahead. He is not asked to avert the flood, because the flood is not negotiable. He is asked to articulate it, to bring clarity where there is confusion. This too would have resonated deeply with ancient listeners. Their world was full of sudden, devastating shifts, wars, famines, political transitions, and often no one understood why these things happened. The Book of Enoch offers an alternative, a world where someone understands, a world where catastrophe has a cause, a world where human suffering is not meaningless but connected to a larger cosmic story. And through Enoch, the audience is given a privileged vantage point. They see the crisis not as victims, but as informed observers. But there is another layer to Enoch's visit, one that speaks to the emotional heart of the story. The watchers, after receiving their sentence, ask Enoch to revisit them, to deliver the final message with his own voice. And when Enoch returns, he finds them transformed. Their earlier boldness has evaporated. Their regret has deepened into quiet despair. They sit by the waters of earth, unable to move, unable to undo what they've done, waiting for a judgment they now know is inevitable. This scene is one of the most haunting in the entire text. The watchers, once radiant and powerful, now appear almost pitiable. They are not monsters. They are not tyrants. They are failed guardians. Their tragedy is not that they were evil, but that they were impulsive. And in a way, their sorrow mirrors the sorrow of humanity itself. They made decisions without foreseeing the consequences. They followed desire without understanding the cost. They broke the world without intending to, and now they must face the repercussions, not with defiance, but with grief. Enoch watches them silently. He does not berate them. He does not console them. He simply stands in the role he was given, the one who knows, the one who sees, the one who understands. His calm presence highlights the contrast between divine order and celestial regret. He is the quiet midpoint between heaven's clarity and earth's chaos. And when he leaves them, ascending once again into vision, he carries with him the knowledge of what is coming. A world washed clean, a new lineage preserved, and a cosmic story that stretches far beyond his own lifetime. With this, Enoch's role as intermediary transforms into something greater. He is now a witness to the unfolding of divine judgment, a recorder of the hidden workings of the cosmos, and the voice who explains why the world must be reshaped. His journey is far from over, but this segment marks the turning point where Enoch transitions from messenger to visionary historian. Chapter 3: Forbidden Knowledge, the Secrets that Broke the World. Up to this point, the story has focused on the Watcher's choices and the consequences spilling across the world. But in Chapter 3, we shift our attention to something more subtle, something that sits at the very heart of the Book of Enoch, the idea of forbidden knowledge. The Watchers didn't just fall because of desire or disobedience. They fell because they taught humanity things it wasn't ready to know. And while modern readers often gloss over this as if it were simply a mythic footnote, angels taught people some magic tricks. Moving on, ancient audiences would have felt the weight of this idea far more directly. Knowledge wasn't entertainment. Knowledge was power. Knowledge was danger. Knowledge was the invisible force that separated the rulers from the ruled. and the suggestion that the wrong knowledge arrived too early in the wrong way from the wrong source would have struck ancient listeners as both insightful and unnerving. To understand why, we first have to slow down and step inside the emotional and social atmosphere of ancient life again. Most people lived without access to specialized information. Farming techniques were inherited, not invented. Calendar cycles were mysteries managed by priests. Metalworking required secret skills passed down through tightly controlled families or guilds. Herbal medicine was steeped in ritual knowledge accessible only to those taught directly by elders or healers. You didn't learn these things by reading a scroll in a quiet room. You learned them through years of apprenticeship or not at all. Knowledge was restricted because the world itself was restricted, fragile, imbalanced, easily thrown into crisis by misuse. So when the Book of Enoch says the Watchers taught humanity sorcery, the cutting of roots, the signs of the heavens, the art of metal, and even the beautifying of eyelids, it's not listing random curiosities. It's listing the very tools that shape influence. It's listing the professional secrets that give certain people leverage. These are technologies, social, spiritual, metallurgical, that alter power dynamics in profound ways. And ancient audiences who saw firsthand how monopolies of knowledge created hierarchies would immediately recognize what the text was implying. Power arrived too fast. Power was handled irresponsibly. Power was distributed unevenly and without context. Let's approach this in practical terms. Metallurgy, learning to extract and shape metal, changed everything. A bronze blade or an iron spear isn't just a tool, it's a political statement. Whoever controls metal controls warfare. Whoever controls warfare controls territory. Whoever controls territory controls wealth, food, people. For ancient villagers, watching someone wield a metal weapon for the first time must have felt almost supernatural. And here comes the Book of Enoch saying, yes, it was supernatural in a sense. This didn't develop gradually. It was dropped into your world from above by beings who didn't consider what would happen afterward. That idea would have been a balm to those oppressed by warriors or raiders who seemed impossibly powerful. It offered an explanation that didn't blame ordinary people for being outmatched. But metallurgy wasn't the only form of forbidden knowledge. The Watchers also taught enchantments, the use of roots and herbs, and the reading of celestial signs. All of these would have deeply affected social structures. Imagine living in a world where almost everything that happens, sickness, storms, pregnancy, death, plague, sudden fortune, feels like a mysterious event tied to invisible forces. Now imagine a person claiming they know which root cures fever, which star pattern predicts drought, which incantation protects a household. That person has power. Not physical power, but the kind of power that shapes trust, fear, and decision-making. And the Book of Enoch suggests these abilities were handed out irresponsibly, without context, by angels who did not understand how human societies functioned. Even something as innocuous sounding as the beautifying of eyelids carries political meaning. Cosmetics were not merely decorative in ancient cultures. They could signify status, seduction, protection, or ritual identity. In the Enochic worldview, teaching such techniques too early could alter relationships, destabilize communities, amplify desire, jealousy, or competition. Whether or not you personally find eyeliner world-altering, ancient listeners would have understood the symbolism. Even small forms of knowledge can disrupt social equilibrium when introduced without guidance. This brings us to the deeper question underlying all these details. Why was the knowledge forbidden? Modern readers sometimes assume the prohibition was arbitrary, but the Book of Enoch hints at a much more thoughtful perspective. Knowledge isn't bad on its own. Knowledge becomes dangerous when given without wisdom, without responsibility, without a moral or social framework to contain it. The metaphor here is simple. A flame isn't dangerous until you place it near dry grass. The Watchers didn't just bring knowledge, they brought it to a world not ready to receive it. Think about how technology works in the modern world. If you gave an advanced computer virus to a group of teenagers who didn't understand international law, you wouldn't be surprised when things spiraled out of control. If you gave nuclear physics to a society still learning how to build stable governments, disaster would be inevitable. The Book of Enoch expresses the same concern, not about literal angels handing out software, of course, but about the mismatch between knowledge and maturity. Humanity in the Enochic worldview was still in its infancy. It needed structure, discipline, gradual development. The Watchers overwhelmed humanity's developmental stage with tools it couldn't use safely. Now imagine hearing this story in a time when your village has been overtaken by warriors wielding superior weapons, or when priests claim the stars dictate who rules and who doesn't, or when someone uses herbs or charms to influence others. You'd feel a sense of recognition. You might think, yes, of course, someone gave these people power they didn't earn. Someone disrupted the natural progression of society. The blame shifts from human weakness to cosmic interference. And again, for ancient communities living under foreign rule or suffering under social disparities, that shift is emotionally relieving. It protects human dignity. It suggests the world wasn't meant to be this unfair. But the Book of Enoch isn't simply blaming angels for everything. It's reflecting a deeper truth about human nature. We crave knowledge even when we're not ready for it. We reach for tools that reshape our world before we consider the cost. The Watchers simply accelerate this tendency to catastrophic speed. They become the mythic embodiment of what happens when desire outpaces wisdom, and the consequences, the rise of tyrants, the spread of violence, the corruption of communities, become metaphors for the consequences of misused knowledge on every scale. This is where the tone of the Book of Enoch becomes strangely modern. It anticipates a theme that appears throughout history. Knowledge is double-edged. Innovation solves problems and creates new ones. Power liberates and oppresses. Technology uplifts and destroys. The story of the Watchers isn't about demonizing knowledge. It's about warning against knowledge divorced from responsibility. And that message would have felt deeply relevant to ancient listeners, just as it feels relevant now. But there's another layer here, softer and more emotional. When Enoch receives the visions explaining how knowledge corrupted the world, he doesn't react with anger, he reacts with sadness. He sees the suffering caused by misuse, but he also sees the longing behind the misuse, the human desire to understand, to control, to improve one's circumstances. He sees why people would accept forbidden knowledge, even if it destroyed them. And Enoch's quiet sorrow mirrors the sorrow of anyone who has watched a society hurt itself with tools it doesn't fully understand. This emotional complexity is what makes the Book of Enoch so compelling. It doesn't portray humanity as helpless victims or foolish opportunists. It portrays humanity as vulnerable, curious, easily overwhelmed, and easily influenced. In other words, thoroughly human. And forbidden knowledge becomes not merely a plot device, but a mirror reflecting all the ways human beings grapple with power. As chapter 3 continues, Enoch's visions will grow even stranger, revealing how heavenly forces respond to the imbalance created by forbidden knowledge and what role Enoch must play in communicating this to the world below. If chapter 3 begins with the question of what the Watchers taught, the next question naturally becomes why that knowledge mattered so much, why it broke the world, why it changed the course of human history, and why Enoch is shown again and again that some forms of wisdom are too heavy for early humanity to bear. The Book of Enoch doesn't treat forbidden knowledge like a magical hack or a cool cheat code given out by rogue angels. It treats it like a weight, something that, once placed on human shoulders, bends them, warps them, sometimes crushes them. And to understand the Enochic worldview, we have to sit with that idea for a while. The idea that knowledge is not neutral, and that knowing too much too early can be more destructive than not knowing at all. Imagine again the ancient world not as a primitive setting but as a fragile ecosystem, delicate, interdependent, constantly at risk of imbalance. People lived very close to the edge of survival, and the slightest disruption could send entire communities into chaos. A failed harvest, a sudden drought, a raid by a neighboring tribe, a plague moving silently along trade routes. These events didn't just cause discomfort, they caused collapse, and collapse often meant death. So when the Book of Enoch talks about forbidden knowledge, it's really talking about something far bigger, about injecting volatile power into a world barely strong enough to hold itself together. Let's start with the most concrete example: weaponry. We mentioned earlier how metallurgy wasn't just a technological advancement, it was a shift in power. But imagine the emotional experience of being part of a community that suddenly encounters metal weapons for the first time. Bronze blades that don't shatter, iron spears that punch through shields, armor that turns warriors into walking fortresses. In our modern world, we already know what technological leaps do in warfare: gunpowder, cannons, machine guns, drones. But for an ancient audience, watching a new class of soldier emerge with tools no one could defend against would have felt like watching the world itself tilt. The Book of Enoch recognizes this. It says, essentially, this escalation wasn't natural, it wasn't earned. It arrived prematurely, delivered by beings who didn't understand the consequences. And ancient listeners would have murmured in agreement. Of course it arrived too fast. Of course violence spread too quickly. Of course war became impossible to control. They had seen the results firsthand. But weapons were only one aspect. The Watchers also taught humans how to interpret the stars, not simply in terms of seasons, but in terms of omens and destinies. They taught forms of divination that could influence kingship, justice, and personal relationships. Suddenly, authority wasn't just about strength or seniority. It became about who knew how to read the sky, who knew which constellation signaled victory, who knew when to travel, when to stay home, when to plant, when to treat illness, when to declare war. Knowledge of the heavens became a tool for controlling the behavior of others. If that sounds familiar, it's because human societies have repeated this pattern countless times, from oracles in Greece, to royal astrologers in medieval courts, to modern financial analysts predicting market behavior with charts and patterns most people don't understand. The Enochic worldview simply frames the origin of all that influence as a cosmic mistake. And yet the most unsettling part of the Watcher's forbidden knowledge is not the grand mystical teaching but the intimate ones. The herbs, the enchantments, the cosmetics, the subtle insights into human psychology. These are the tools that manipulate desire, fear, attraction, status, and trust. These are the tools that change family dynamics, rivalries, politics, and mating rituals. These are the tools that reshaped the internal world long before they reshaped the external one. To ancient listeners, it was obvious what this meant. Knowledge influences not only events, but emotions. The cutting of roots isn't just medicine, it's influence. Cosmetics aren't just decoration, they're social power. Enchantments aren't just superstition, they're the early vocabulary of persuasion. The Watchers weren't simply teaching humanity how to build things, they were teaching humanity how to manipulate, seduce, intimidate, heal, harm, persuade, and control. They were introducing tools that reshape relationships, and without ethical structure behind them, those tools quickly became weapons. This is why the Book of Enoch insists that knowledge came too early. Humanity in this narrative is portrayed as a child, curious, eager, bright, but unprepared for the weight of cosmic secrets. The Watchers, in breaking their role, effectively handed a toddler a lit torch and said, "Here, figure out what to do with this." And the results were catastrophic not because humans were malicious, but because humans were inexperienced. Now let's shift perspective and imagine how Enoch reacts to this revelation. As he ascends through the heavenly realms, he sees how much knowledge is woven into the structure of creation, the paths of the stars, the laws of natural cycles, the forces that govern wind and water. In heaven, knowledge is ordered, disciplined, contextualized. Nothing is out of place. Nothing is misused. Knowledge is not a toy, but a responsibility. So when Enoch learns that the Watchers took pieces of this cosmic structure and handed them to humans without permission, he understands instantly why the world below is unraveling. Knowledge ripped from context becomes chaos. There's a subtle cynicism running through this part of the text, a tone that says, humans didn't invent their own suffering, but once given the tools, humans became very efficient at amplifying it. The Book of Enoch never portrays humanity as blameless, it simply portrays humanity as overwhelmed, and Enoch, watching the consequences unfold from the vantage point of heaven, begins to understand that the world is nearing a breaking point, not because humanity is evil, but because humanity is overloaded. The most profound part of this segment of Enoch's visions is the emotional insight it gives into the relationship between knowledge and suffering. The Book of Enoch is effectively asking, what happens when you know things you cannot handle? What happens when you become aware of forces you cannot control? These questions aren't ancient curiosities, they're timeless. Humanity has always reached for knowledge too quickly, from early metallurgy to the atomic age to artificial intelligence. Every leap forward brings benefits and risks, liberation and destruction. Enoch's vision captures that tension in its earliest mythological form. But the text also includes a small, easily overlooked detail that ancient listeners would have found deeply meaningful. Enoch is told that some knowledge will eventually belong to humanity, but not yet. Not in this era. Not in the fragile, violent world shaped by the Watchers. In other words, forbidden knowledge is not inherently forbidden forever. Humanity simply needs time, structure, wisdom, stability. The world must grow before it can safely carry the weight of cosmic secrets. This idea that knowledge has a timetable is rare in ancient literature, and it transforms Enoch's story from a simple tale of rebellion into a thoughtful meditation on human development. The Watchers disrupted the timeline. They accelerated growth that should have been gradual. They injected power into a society without the moral or social architecture to handle it. And Enoch's visions suggest that this premature empowerment is the true cause of the world's imbalance, even more than the giants or the violence. This is why heaven responds not with rage but with cleanup. The flood, The confinement of the Watchers, the extinguishing of the Nephilim, these are not acts of divine temper, but acts of restoration. The clock is being rewound. The world is being reset to a stage where humanity can continue its slow, natural development without interference. And Enoch, standing there as the first human to grasp this entire cosmic framework, becomes the bridge between two truths. Humanity is vulnerable, but humanity is not incapable. Humanity is misled, but humanity is not doomed. Humanity is overwhelmed, but not inherently flawed. Knowledge arrived early, but knowledge will eventually be humanity's inheritance once the world is ready. In the next segment, Enoch's visions will take him deeper into the cosmic archives, showing him not only the consequences of forbidden knowledge, but the larger, almost architectural ways the universe holds balance together, and what happens when that balance is disturbed. As Enoch is guided deeper into the heavenly realms, the visions shift again. For 2 chapters now, he has witnessed the emotional fallout of the Watchers' rebellion, the imbalance introduced by forbidden knowledge, and the unfolding consequences that ripple across Earth. But in this next phase of his journey, the Book of Enoch draws back the curtain on something even more fundamental. The idea that the universe itself keeps record, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. Enoch is shown a cosmic ledger, a system of accountability woven into creation. And for ancient listeners, this idea would have been astonishing and comforting in equal measure. Imagine living in a world without consistent justice, a world where disputes are settled not by law, but by strength, wealth, status, or whim. A world where poor farmers are punished for small transgressions while powerful men commit violence without consequence. Ancient societies understood injustice intimately. It was the background radiation of daily life. So the claim that the universe has its own bookkeeping system, one that records everything, forgets nothing, and judges impartially, would have landed with immense weight. It is one of the oldest human yearnings, the hope that someone, somewhere, is keeping track. In Enoch's vision, the heavenly archives are not dusty scroll rooms or quiet libraries. They are living structures. Light moves through them like breath. The walls pulse with meaning. The very air feels dense with memory. Enoch sees angels assigned to watch over the deeds of nations, angels who transcribe human actions not as gossip, but as data, the raw material of cosmic judgment. Nothing escapes their attention. Nothing is too small. A whisper of corruption, an act of compassion, a violent outburst, a quiet gesture of generosity, all of it is preserved. If the Watcher's mistake was to intervene prematurely in human affairs, these heavenly scribes do the opposite. They observe perfectly and act only when commanded. This idea that the cosmos has administrators might sound strange to a modern audience accustomed to thinking of heaven as an abstract spiritual realm. But to ancient listeners, it made perfect sense. Every society they knew had scribes, accountants, record keepers. Temples tracked offerings, kings tracked taxes, courts tracked oaths. Why wouldn't the divine world do the same, only with more precision? The Book of Enoch describes heaven not as a place of idle clouds and harps, but as a functioning bureaucracy, efficient, organized, incorruptible. And for people who had grown accustomed to human bureaucracies that were anything but incorruptible, this vision offered a sharp and soothing contrast. As Enoch moves through these celestial record halls, he begins to understand something unsettling. The imbalance caused by the Watchers is not localized. It's not just a human problem or an earthly problem. It's a cosmic problem. the violence of the Nephilim, the misuse of forbidden knowledge, the distortion of human society, all of it creates a kind of spiritual pollution that echoes upward. Heaven is not aloof, it feels the tremors. The records themselves reveal the strain. It's as if the moral order of the universe is an instrument, and the Watcher's rebellion has knocked it out of tune. Enoch also notices that the cosmic records include more than just human deeds. They catalog seasons, winds, natural cycles, astral patterns. Everything is monitored and maintained. Everything has an order, a schedule, a purpose. Nothing in creation is left unwatched, and this makes the Watcher's failure all the more glaring. They were supposed to guard the earth just as other angels guard the stars, the oceans, the seasons. Their negligence isn't framed as a singular mistake. It's framed as a breach of a cosmic network that depends on consistency. They didn't simply break a rule, they disrupted the architecture of reality. To ancient listeners accustomed to thinking of nature as unpredictable and dangerous, this part of Enoch's vision would have reframed the world entirely. Floods, storms, droughts, plagues, all the terrifying impersonal forces that shaped their lives now appeared within a structured, comprehensible framework. The universe wasn't chaotic, it was organized, and when the organization faltered, it wasn't because God was absent, it was because celestial guardians failed their responsibilities. Enoch watches as great books or tablets, the translation varies, are presented before the throne. They glow with inscriptions that shift like currents of water, living text, and he realizes that the judgment of the Watchers is not a spur-of-the-moment decision. It is based on evidence, on transcripts, on patterns accumulated over time, not divine whim, but divine audit. This is the cosmic version of perfect paperwork, the kind of documentation human courts could only dream of. One of the more intriguing parts of this vision is when Enoch is shown the records of the earth's cry. The earth itself is personified in the book of Enoch, not as a sentient being in a literal sense, but as a symbol of all creation. The earth groans under the weight of violence. The fields are stained by bloodshed. The natural rhythms, planting, harvesting, feeding, resting, are disrupted by the endless appetite of the Nephilim and the weapons humans now wield. In this narrative, the earth is not passive. It protests, it reports, it testifies, and its testimony is recorded in the heavenly books alongside human deeds. This would have resonated profoundly with people whose lives depended directly on the soil. When the land failed, they suffered. When violence spread, the fields burned. When rulers demanded too much tribute, the earth produced less the following year because the people who tended it were exhausted. In the book of Enoch, this practical truth becomes a spiritual truth. The earth itself suffers under injustice, and heaven takes note. But there is also something a bit cynical in this segment of the text, a recognition that while heaven is perfectly organized, the world below remains messy. The cosmic ledger does not prevent wrongdoing, it simply records it. It does not shield humanity from suffering. It catalogs the causes. It does not stop tyrants in the moment. It ensures their actions are not forgotten. The Book of Enoch does not promise immediate justice. It promises inevitable justice. And that subtle distinction would have struck ancient listeners with painful clarity. They knew too well that justice delayed often looks like justice denied. Enoch's vision offers the comforting, if sometimes frustrating, assurance that nothing escapes the divine accounting system. Enoch, looking at the cosmic ledger, begins to understand the full scale of his role. He is not just a messenger, he is a translator of cosmic evidence. He is shown what the universe sees. He is asked to record it in human language. He becomes, in effect, the bridge between two bureaucracies, the flawed human one below and the flawless divine one above. And as he absorbs this task, he realizes another truth. Much of what humanity fears is simply the result of incomplete information. Forbidden knowledge broke the world, but missing knowledge also torments it. Humans suffer from what they do not know. Why disasters happen, why tyrants rise, why the innocent suffer, why the guilty prosper. The cosmic ledger answers these questions, but in heaven, not on earth. That is why Enoch must write. His writings become a small, imperfect window into the perfect records of heaven. Humanity cannot bear the full weight of cosmic truth, but it can bear a glimpse, enough to understand that suffering has causes, that rebellion has consequences, that the universe is not asleep. And the Book of Enoch presents Enoch's writings as a kind of divine memo. Not everything will make sense now, but everything is observed, everything is remembered, and everything will eventually be addressed. In this part of the vision, Enoch is shown not only the records of the past, but hints of the future, patterns, cycles, the way certain events inevitably repeat because human nature repeats. The cosmic ledger, in a sense, becomes a teacher, showing Enoch that history is not random but rhythmic, and this insight that the universe has patterns is one of the earliest expressions of a concept that later becomes central in many religious traditions, the idea of divine timing. But for now, Enoch's task is simply to watch, understand, and prepare to bring this knowledge back to a world that is about to face a cleansing it cannot avoid. As Enoch's journey continues beyond the halls of records and judgment, he is shown something deeper still, what you might call the hidden engines of the world. If the cosmic ledger reveals what is happening on Earth, then the next vision explains why the universe holds together despite everything. This is where the Book of Enoch becomes almost architectural in its imagination, revealing a cosmos that runs on structure, precision, and balance. And for ancient listeners who spent their lives watching the sky for signs, reading seasons like scripture, and interpreting natural rhythms with reverence, these visions did more than satisfy curiosity. They offered a way of understanding the world as an ordered, intentional creation, even when the human layer of it seemed chaotic and unjust. Enoch is shown the places where cosmic forces originate, places where winds are stored, where stars are kept, where waters are suspended, where the luminaries begin their appointed paths. The text describes chambers, gates, vaults, and reservoirs, not because ancient people thought the heavens were literal storage rooms, but because this was the only language available to describe structure. The universe is not random, the universe is managed, and Enoch is taken behind the scenes to witness that management directly. Imagine Enoch standing at the threshold of a vast chamber filled with light that behaves like liquid, flowing along invisible channels. Angels tend to these streams the way scribes tend to scrolls, ensuring that each ray of light reaches its proper destination. To an ancient audience, the sun didn't just illuminate the day, it governed it. The moon didn't just brighten the night, it regulated festivals, rituals, agriculture. Stars weren't distant suns in a scientific sense. They were markers, symbols, servants of cosmic order. And here, in Enoch's vision, the celestial bodies are shown as members of a disciplined system, moving according to decrees, not whim. It's hard for us, living in a world of electric lighting and automated clocks, to appreciate how intimately ancient people experienced celestial patterns. The rising and setting of the sun shaped every task, every journey, every meal. Lunar phases guided planting, harvesting, sacrifice, and rest. The stars served as calendars, compasses, even omens. So when the Book of Enoch depicts angels responsible for guiding the heavenly bodies, it's not a flight of imagination so much as an affirmation. The world is reliable because someone is keeping it reliable. Natural law is not blind, it is maintained. Enoch is shown the storehouses of the wind, a phrase that, to ancient audiences, would have been rich with meaning. Wind was more than weather. It was life and danger, blessing and curse, a force that brought rain or devastation, heat or coolness, calm or violent storms. By portraying wind as something stored and released, the text invites the listener to imagine a universe where even the unpredictable has its own cosmic supervisor. Wind is not an accident, it is scheduled. And anyone who has lived close to the edge of agriculture understands how comforting that idea is. The forces that sustain life are not random. Then Enoch is led to the boundaries of the great waters, the reservoirs of rain, the chambers of dew, the places where snow and hail are kept until their appointed times. This might sound poetic to modern ears, but ancient people thought about precipitation constantly. Rain meant food, drought meant death. Snow on distant mountains determined river levels months later. The Book of Enoch takes these concerns and weaves them into a vision where every drop is accounted for, every storm follows a pattern, every season is guided by appointed guardians. This cosmic oversight stands in stark contrast to the world corrupted by the Watchers. On earth, imbalance reigns. In heaven, balance never breaks. But it's in Enoch's vision of the stars that the text becomes particularly beautiful and unexpectedly scientific in its own mythological way. He is shown the gates of the sun and moon, the portals through which they rise and set, the precise intervals that keep time itself functioning. To ancient listeners who tracked time through shadows, moon cycles, and painstaking observation, the idea that these motions were governed from above was profoundly reassuring. Time was not slipping. Time was not arbitrary. The days, seasons, and years themselves were stitched into the architecture of creation. And then comes one of the Book of Enoch's most striking ideas. Some stars rebel. Just as the Watchers fell, some stars fail to follow their appointed paths. They deviate. They wander, and for this deviation they are judged. This connection between celestial order and celestial rebellion mirrors the human world perfectly. Just as rulers sometimes stray from justice, stars sometimes stray from their paths, and the universe corrects both. Ancient listeners would have understood this analogy intuitively. Cosmic order, like social order, requires discipline. Without discipline, the world unravels. But Enoch's vision isn't merely about the mechanics of the universe, it's about responsibility. Every force, every element, every light in the sky has a guardian, a steward, someone maintaining the structure. And this is what makes the Watchers' rebellion so significant. They were part of this system, trusted with oversight, expected to maintain harmony, and they failed. That failure didn't merely disrupt their own realm, it disrupted everything below it. This is why the consequences are so severe. In a universe this interconnected, a small breach creates massive ripples. Imagine Enoch absorbing all of this, not as a scientist or philosopher, but as a humble man witnessing cosmic governance for the first time. There's a quiet wisdom in how he observes. He doesn't rush to interpret. He doesn't argue. He doesn't try to assert himself. He simply sees the world behind the world, and by seeing it, he understands what humanity cannot, that balance is fragile, that order is intentional, and that the chaos unfolding on Earth is the result of a breach in a system far more complex than any human could manage. At this point, the narrative becomes subtly cynical again, not in a hopeless way, but in a grounded way. Enoch realizes that human suffering is not random, but it is also not something humanity can fix alone. The forces that disrupt life, war, famine, violence, are sometimes the result of cosmic failures, not human ones. And yet, humans must endure the consequences. It reflects an ancient truth people knew well. Sometimes you suffer because of decisions made far above you. Sometimes the world shakes not because you caused it, but because someone else did. The Book of Enoch gives theological shape to that universal feeling, but it also offers reassurance. The same cosmic system that records wrongdoing and governs the forces of nature is already working to correct the imbalance. The universe isn't spiraling into chaos, it's recalibrating. Enoch sees angels preparing for the cleansing of the earth, angels restoring corrupted elements, angels realigning the paths of luminaries. Creation is resilient. Even after disruption, it can return to equilibrium. And that is perhaps the quiet wisdom embedded in this chapter. The world breaks, but the world also heals, not instantly, not without judgment or consequence, but inevitably. Enoch, having now seen the cosmic mechanisms of order, understands that the Watcher's rebellion wasn't simply a scandal. It was a systemic failure that required a systemic response. And he knows, as he prepares to return to Earth, that humanity will face the cleansing to come not as victims, but as participants in a restoration far larger than the boundaries of their villages. With Chapter 3 complete, the stage is now set for Chapter 4, where we shift into the contrasting world of elites, kings, and the ancient ruling class. The people whose lives seemed untouched by cosmic imbalance, yet who were shaped by it just as profoundly as everyone else. Chapter 4: Power, Fragility, and the Elite. The Watcher's echo in human hierarchy. Up to this point, we've spent most of our time in the world of ordinary people. Farmers, villagers, craftspeople, and families who lived close to the soil and even closer to uncertainty. But the Book of Enoch, like most ancient texts, existed in a world with another layer. The elites, the rulers, the kings, the nobles, the people whose lives unfolded in spacious courtyards, surrounded by servants, protected by walls, and elevated above the daily grind. And when you shift the lens upward to examine life at the top, the story of the Watchers and the Nephilim takes on a different flavor. Less about fear and more about aspiration, status, and the uneasy comfort of people who thought they were safe. To understand how the elites heard the Enochic story, imagine stepping into their world. Not the fantasy palaces of movies, towering marble structures gleaming with gold, but the real seats of power in the ancient Near East, thick-walled residences built of stone or mud brick elevated above the surrounding houses, courtyards shaded by woven canopies, storage rooms full of grain and textiles, guards posted at thresholds, bronze vessels for washing and drinking, a small but steady stream of visitors bringing tribute, news, or requests for judgment. Power wasn't glamorous so much as insulated. Elites lived with more food, more space, more time, and far more certainty than the average person. But they also lived with a deeper awareness of hierarchy, the constant need to perform authority, maintain alliances, and legitimize their position. It is here, in this world of political performance, that the story of the Watchers picks up a new resonance. To the elites, the Watchers were not merely corrupt angels, they were cautionary reflections of themselves, powerful beings whose confidence outpaced their wisdom. figures whose downfall was rooted not in malice but in overreach. And if you were an ancient king hearing this story recited at a feast, you might shift uncomfortably, recognizing the parallels. It's the ancient equivalent of hearing a moral tale about CEOs who fall from grace while you're still holding your golden goblet. But before we dive into the psychological impact on rulers, we need to paint their world clearly. Elites lived with luxuries that set them apart from ordinary people. Finely woven garments dyed with expensive pigments, jewelry worked from gold or lapis, access to exotic goods brought by traders, spices, incense, perfumes, precious stones. They ate more meat, drank stronger wine, and enjoyed feasts that could last for days. Their homes had private chambers, clay tablets or scrolls full of correspondence, and enough labor at their disposal to avoid the relentless physical exhaustion that defined most ancient lives. Yet luxury didn't equal peace. An elite household was never fully quiet. Servants moved constantly, preparing food, grinding grain, heating water, tending animals. Guards kept an eye on visitors. Political rivals sent gifts with uncertain motives. Messengers arrived from other regions with rumors of war, taxation changes, or shifting alliances. If the villagers lived in a world ruled by uncertainty from nature, elites lived in a world ruled by uncertainty from people. Ambition, betrayal, alliances, succession disputes. These were the storms that threatened the powerful. And this is where the Book of Enoch becomes more than a cosmic myth. It becomes a mirror that elites could not ignore. The Watchers were beings with authority. They were appointed to high positions. They had access to knowledge others did not. They were admired, feared, and obeyed. And then they fell, not because someone overthrew them, but because they lost control of themselves. They slipped. They wanted too much. They crossed a line. For rulers, this was not a story about angels. It was a story about leadership, a reminder that power collapses not from scarcity but from misuse. Imagine a king listening to this story at night, the oil lamps flickering, wine lingering warm in his chest, a musician plucking slow notes in the corner. Outside the palace walls, people labor in fields, but inside the conversation turns to cosmic rebellion. The king hears that even heavenly beings with far more power than he will ever have, suffered ruin because they allowed desire to override duty. And if they, with all their glory, fell, what does that say about human rulers? This story was not comfortable for them, and yet it was captivating. Power in the ancient world was incredibly fragile. Kings rose and fell with breathtaking speed. Some were assassinated by their own guards. Some lost wars and vanished into exile. Some were overthrown by relatives. Some simply mismanaged their resources and watched their kingdoms crumble. So when the Book of Enoch describes a cosmic hierarchy where even the mighty are judged, elites heard something they rarely encountered among their flatterers: accountability. Not the human kind they could occasionally dodge, but a divine kind they could not. But it's not only judgment that elites recognized in the Watchers, it was the allure of forbidden knowledge. Rulers, more than anyone else, understood the value of secrets, secret alliances, secret rituals, secret military strategies, secret interpretations of omens. These were the tools of governance. The Watchers' forbidden teachings, metallurgy, enchantments, astrology, were the kinds of knowledge elites prized. These weren't mere curiosities, these were instruments of rule, and hearing that angels once provided these very tools would have stirred a mixture of fascination and apprehension. A ruler might wonder, if my authority is built on knowledge, and knowledge itself came from a cosmic mistake, then how secure is my power? That's not a fun question to contemplate while lounging on a carved wooden seat. The elites also lived closer to the symbolic world than commoners did. They sponsored temples, consulted diviners, commissioned inscriptions, and invoked divine legitimacy whenever making decisions. So when Enoch's story described the heavens as a bureaucratic institution with layers of administrators, elites understood it instinctively. Kingdoms mirrored cosmos. Cosmos mirrored kingdoms. If heaven punished the watchers for misrule, then earthly rulers might see themselves reflected, for better or worse. But there's another wrinkle. Elites liked the idea of giants, not literal towering beings stomping across the landscape, but the metaphor of larger-than-life heroes. Nobles and kings often traced their ancestry to gods, demigods, or legendary warriors. The Nephilim, in that sense, were strangely flattering. They symbolized exceptional lineage, special strength, divine favor, the very mythology kings like to associate with themselves. But Enoch weaponizes that idea. He turns the heroic giant into a cautionary figure. He says these exceptional beings had power, but they lacked restraint. They destroyed themselves, and those who admired them suffered too. For elites, this was a quiet warning, a reminder that grandeur is not immunity, that being exceptional does not guarantee survival, that power, when unchecked, becomes monstrous. Now imagine an elite hearing this, not in a crowded marketplace, but in a private chamber. The text wasn't written for public recitation alone. It circulated among scribes, priests, scholars, and political networks. Some rulers may have heard it in private readings, their advisors murmuring commentary. Others may have encountered fragments of the story embedded in regional traditions. But wherever they heard it, the message would have been the same. The higher you climb, the harder you fall when you lose balance. Enoch becomes, in this context, not a prophet of doom, but a philosopher of restraint. He observes cosmic authority without trying to seize it. He witnesses judgment without attempting to rewrite it. He models a kind of power elites rarely practiced, the power of understanding rather than domination. For a moment, even kings could feel small in this story, not in a humiliating way, but in a grounding way. The narrative says, even you, with your wealth and armies, exist within a larger order. You do not escape it, you do not outrank it, and that realization, quiet though it is, has a calming weight, the kind of weight that ancient rulers may have felt as they drifted into sleep after hearing these tales, wondering which parts applied to them. With the world of elites now drawn into the picture, the next segment will take us deeper into their psychology, how they interpreted cosmic justice, how they understood divine hierarchy, and how they positioned themselves within a universe where accountability reached even the heavens. If ordinary people heard the Book of Enoch and felt a sense of relief, finally an explanation for why the world seemed tilted, the elites felt something more complicated. Not fear exactly, and not comfort either, but an uneasy awareness that the story was speaking directly to them even when it pretended not to, because the elites of the ancient world were not just wealthy individuals with nicer homes, they were the nodes through which cosmic meaning flowed into society. Kings and priests were expected to stand between gods and people, to maintain order, to interpret signs, to enforce justice. And any story about cosmic rebellion, cosmic judgment, and cosmic hierarchy inevitably touched on their identity, whether they welcomed it or not. Let's start with the king, the figure who, in many ancient societies, was believed to embody the intersection of heaven and earth. Kingship wasn't just a political arrangement, it was a metaphysical one. The king ruled because the gods allowed it. He governed not just through military strength but through divine endorsement. His legitimacy depended on an unbroken chain between his authority and the heavens above. So when he hears the book of Enoch describe angels, celestial officials far higher than he, being judged and punished for misuse of authority, it would have struck him like a quiet thunderclap. It suggested a frightening truth. No one is too high to fall. For the king, this wasn't simply a moral tale. It was a structural warning. If the Watcher's authority was conditional, then so was his. If the Watchers lost their place for crossing boundaries, then his own boundaries were also sacred. If heaven was willing to imprison its own servants, then what chance did a mortal ruler have if he became corrupt? Remember, ancient kings didn't have the modern luxury of assuming they were beyond scrutiny. Many lived with the constant fear that their gods could abandon them. Crop failures, eclipses, violent storms, all could be interpreted as signs that the king had fallen out of favor. The Book of Enoch reinforces this anxiety. It tells the king, "You are not secure just because you sit on a throne. Authority is a loan, not a birthright." Now consider the priests. If kings embodied political authority, priests embodied spiritual authority. They were the interpreters of omens, the keepers of ritual, the custodians of sacred knowledge. Unlike the king who displayed power visibly, the priest displayed power invisibly through symbols, rituals, recitations, and the careful performance of sacred tradition. Priests had a monopoly on spiritual expertise. Their authority wasn't maintained by soldiers but by mystique, and the Book of Enoch shakes that mystique. It says, in essence, sacred knowledge can be corrupted. It reminds priests that knowledge itself has a history, and not all of that history is divine. If some knowledge came from rebellious angels, then not everything that appears sacred is safe. Not everything that appears spiritual is trustworthy. Priests, who based their entire identity on being the correct interpreters of divine will, suddenly found themselves in a story where divine will had been violated in the distant past, and where knowledge had been introduced in ways that bypassed proper channels. This would have made some priests uncomfortable. It blurred the boundary between divine revelation and dangerous revelation. It forced them to consider whether some of their rituals, symbols, or teachings were remnants of earlier cosmic corruption. And it forced them to wrestle with a truth Enoch saw clearly. Not all wisdom elevates, some wisdom distorts. To a priesthood that guarded rituals with obsessive care, this narrative was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it affirmed the importance of boundaries. On the other hand, it undermined their monopoly by acknowledging that spiritual knowledge could originate outside legitimate channels. Then there were the scribes, the intellectual elites of the ancient world. They were the ones who read, wrote, calculated, documented, and transmitted traditions. Their power wasn't in brute strength or spiritual charisma, but in literacy, a rare and valuable skill. For scribes, the Book of Enoch was electrifying. It validated their work in a way few texts did. The cosmic ledger Enoch witnessed, the heavenly records, the accounts of deeds, the inscriptions of judgment, mirrored the work scribes did daily. Heaven, in this vision, is full of scribal activity. It records, it preserves, it judges based on written evidence. To the scribes, this meant their work wasn't simply administrative, it was cosmic. Their ink and clay tablets echoed the very structure of heaven. But this recognition came with a shadow. The heavenly records were flawless, impartial, incorruptible. Human records were not. Scribes could be pressured by kings, bribed by nobles, manipulated by priests. They lived in a world where documentation could be rewritten, erased, or lost. So when they heard Enoch describe a realm where no deed is forgotten, no entry is altered, and no influence can sway the final judgment, they were faced with a humbling comparison. Heaven's archive made theirs look fragile and morally questionable. Yet despite their differences, all elites shared one emotional reaction to the Enochic narrative, a sense that the hierarchy above them was far stricter and far more stable than the hierarchy below, and this had profound implications for how they saw themselves. A king might think, if heaven holds its officials accountable, then my subjects will expect me to rule justly, lest I mirror the watchers. A priest might think, if angels can misuse knowledge, I must be vigilant not to distort the rituals entrusted to me. A scribe might think, if heaven records every deed, my own records must be kept with integrity. In other words, the story imposed a standard, not a human standard, but a cosmic one, and elites rarely encountered narratives that demanded this of them. But there's another, subtler layer to examine: how elites understood the concept of cosmic rebellion. Unlike commoners who heard the story as a distant myth explaining suffering, elites heard it as a political allegory. They dealt with rebellion constantly. Coups, uprisings, assassinations, betrayals, these were the occupational hazards of ruling, and the Watchers' rebellion mirrored these all too closely. It wasn't fueled by ideology or justice. It was fueled by desire, ambition, misuse of privilege. It was the cosmic equivalent of palace intrigue, a story the powerful knew intimately. When the Watchers gathered on Mount Hermon and swore an oath to rebel together, it echoed the secret meetings of conspirators uniting to overthrow a king. When the Watchers taught forbidden knowledge to humans, it resembled the way ambitious advisors might arm rival factions with information for their own gain. When the Watchers regretted their rebellion but could not escape judgment, elites would have recognized the tragic arc of countless rulers before them, bold in their rise, doomed in their fall. In this sense, the Book of Enoch wasn't a fantasy for the elites. It was a mirror. A cosmic mirror held uncomfortably close. It told them, you are not exempt from the patterns you impose on others. You are not immune to the consequences you unleash. You are not as secure as you appear. And yet, this wasn't entirely discouraging. Elites also heard something strangely comforting. They were part of a system larger than themselves. Their authority wasn't random. It participated in a cosmic hierarchy that, when functioning correctly, mirrored the order of heaven. They were expected to rule with wisdom because wisdom maintained cosmic equilibrium. They were expected to avoid corruption because corruption disrupted not just society but creation. They were expected to enforce justice because justice aligned them with the cosmic order. For elites accustomed to constant threats, famine, rebellion, rival kings, political sabotage, the idea that their authority was anchored in a universe that valued order over chaos must have offered a rare sense of security. Not absolute security, but meaningful security. The kind that says, you are not ruling alone, you are part of something structured. But it also whispered the uncomfortable corollary. If you abuse this structure, you will fall as surely as the Watchers. This dual message, reassurance and warning, made the Book of Enoch uniquely powerful for the ancient elite psyche. It validated their position while restraining their arrogance. It exalted the role of authority while condemning its misuse. It offered a cosmic explanation for their responsibilities and a cosmic consequence for their failures. In the next segment, we'll explore how elites used the story, how they incorporated it into their own self-image, political rituals, and understanding of destiny. Because while ordinary people saw the Watchers fall as the source of suffering, elites sometimes saw it as something more, a reminder that even cosmic power requires humility. We've explored how elites reacted internally to the story of the Watchers, the discomfort, the fascination, the recognition of their own vulnerabilities reflected in cosmic rebellion. But elites rarely left a story in the realm of introspection. They used stories, they applied them, they absorbed myth into the machinery of power the same way they absorbed surplus grain, tribute, and luxury goods. And the Book of Enoch, with its sweeping cosmology and vivid hierarchy, offered an irresistible template for shaping identity, authority, and social order. If a myth was this vast, this detailed, and this cosmically official, then it could be repurposed, carefully, strategically, to support the agendas of those who needed stories to rule. Let's start with something very simple and very human. Rulers love precedent. No king wanted to appear as if he were making decisions from personal whim. He wanted to ground his authority in ancient tradition, cosmic order, and divine approval. And here, the Book of Enoch offered a rich symbolic vocabulary. It described heaven itself as a hierarchical institution with ranks, duties, boundaries, and consequences. It depicted cosmic administrators who supervised the natural world with precision. It showed judgment flowing downward from a throne that no one, not even angels, could challenge. For a king trying to articulate his own place in the cosmos, this story was a gift. Heaven, in Enoch's vision, looked remarkably like a well-structured kingdom, the kind kings wished their earthly domains could imitate. Elites quickly recognized this parallel. The more closely earthly governance resembled heavenly governance, the more legitimacy it could claim. So the story of the Watchers became part cautionary tale, part political blueprint. Kings could present themselves as the loyal mirror of the heavenly court, orderly, just, restrained, implicitly contrasting themselves with the Watchers, whose rebellion represented everything a ruler must avoid. Priests could frame their rituals as participation in the cosmic hierarchy Enoch described, reinforcing their own importance. Scribes could describe legal and administrative work as earthly reflections of the heavenly records Enoch witnessed. The story became a ladder: divine order, royal order, social order. And while no one announced this structure in political speeches, the symbolism settled quietly into the worldview of the powerful. But this wasn't only about borrowing cosmic architecture, it was also about shaping identity. Elites like to imagine themselves as chosen, selected by the divine for their role, and Enoch's narrative validated this instinct. It introduced the idea that some beings were appointed, not born, into authority. The Watchers were given a position and entrusted with a mission. That structure appealed to rulers who saw their own power as something more meaningful than mere inheritance or conquest. A king might think, if the Watchers were appointed as guardians, perhaps my own kingship is a similar appointment. A priest might think, if angels oversee the luminaries, perhaps I oversee the rituals in the same way, part of a sacred system. Even generals could imagine themselves as reflections of cosmic warriors, though the Book of Enoch rarely indulges martial fantasies directly. Yet elites didn't adopt the story uncritically. They adapted it to suit their needs. For example, while the text clearly warns against the misuse of authority, elites might conveniently emphasize the part where heaven allows hierarchy in the first place. Their interpretation might go something like, "See, even the angels have ranks, even the stars follow appointed paths. Disorder comes not from power itself, but from stepping outside your ordained role." In this version, the king's throne became not just a political institution, but a cosmic echo of heaven's structure. And because people lived in a world trained to look upward for legitimacy, upward to the sky, to omens, to divine intervention, tying royal legitimacy to cosmic patterns was incredibly effective. Priests too found ways to use the story to bolster their authority. The Book of Enoch emphasizes knowledge as dangerous when acquired improperly, but it also implies that knowledge handled through sanctioned channels is safe and beneficial. Priests positioned themselves as those channels. They could claim that only they held the rituals and teachings aligned with divine order. Any outsider claiming spiritual insight might be framed, subtly or directly, as echoing the Watcher's transgression. This gave priests a powerful rhetorical tool. Unauthorized knowledge leads to ruin, and in a world where divination, astrology, herbalism, and magic all blurred together, this distinction mattered. Priests could distance their own practices from the Watchers while criticizing rival practitioners who threatened their influence. But perhaps the most fascinating adaptation comes from how elites used the story to justify social hierarchy. The Book of Enoch divides the cosmos into categories: obedient angels and rebellious angels, celestials and terrestrials, appointed ones and ordinary ones. It outlines a world where position matters, where some beings have access to knowledge others cannot handle. Elites, unsurprisingly, interpreted this as validation. They could argue, just as the heavens have ranks, so does society. Just as some beings are entrusted with special roles, so are we. The myth became a subtle but powerful reinforcement of class divisions. Commoners might have found comfort in the idea that heaven notices suffering, but elites found comfort in the idea that hierarchy itself was divinely patterned. Yet this was not entirely self-serving. Elites also felt the sting of the Watcher's failure. If the highest beings in the cosmos could fall from grace simply by indulging forbidden desires, then earthly elites were not immune to downfall either. This added a layer of anxiety, the quiet fear of losing legitimacy. And while kings rarely worried about celestial punishment, they did worry about earthly collapse. A kingdom plagued by drought, war, disease, or rebellion could easily lose faith in its rulers. The Watcher's story became a metaphor for political fragility. Their downfall reminded elites that authority depended on boundaries, restraint, and wisdom, qualities they often struggled to embody. There's also an intriguing psychological effect at play here. Elites hearing the story might identify not only with the heavenly rulers but also with the Watchers themselves. After all, the Watchers' rebellion didn't begin with malice. It began with desire for beauty, for connection, for influence. They didn't descend as tyrants. They descended as beings convinced they understood humanity better than heaven did. They believed they could improve the world by sharing knowledge, and that, ironically, mirrors the attitude of many ancient rulers who thought that their innovations, conquests, or reforms were justified because they were for the greater good. In this way, the Watcher's sin becomes an uncomfortable reflection of elite ambition, not evil, just unrestrained, not monstrous, just misguided. And ancient elites who were accustomed to bending rules when convenient, who often justified their actions as necessary for stability or prosperity, would have recognized this dynamic. The Watchers weren't villains, they were cautionary analogues. But if elites saw themselves in the Watchers, they also saw the difference. The Watchers had no second chance. Once they crossed the boundary, judgment was absolute. Elites, by contrast, enjoyed a bit more flexibility. They could realign themselves with religious institutions, commission new rituals, sponsor temples, host festivals, or proclaim reforms. They could publicly perform virtue to mask private lapses. In political terms, they could recover legitimacy. Yet the shadow of cosmic accountability lingered. Enoch's visions suggested that some forms of misrule were not repairable. Some actions, once taken, echoed outward in ways no ritual could erase. That discomfort kept the story alive among the elites, repeated in private circles, contemplated during sickness or drought, retold by priests seeking influence, expanded by scribes interpreting omens. It became part of the intellectual and spiritual wallpaper of elite life, and so, even as elites used the story to reinforce their authority, the story quietly worked on them. It whispered that knowledge was dangerous, that power was conditional, that the cosmos ran on principles they could not manipulate. It invited humility, or at least the performance of humility. In a cultural landscape where ego often governed more than wisdom. In the next and final segment of Chapter 4, we'll explore how these storylines culminated at the top, how elites, caught between cosmic caution and earthly advantage, shaped the legacy of the Watchers and the Book of Enoch, often without realizing they were doing it. As we reach the final movement of Chapter 4, the world of the ancient elites comes into clearer focus. We've looked at how they perceived the Watchers as mirrors, warnings, and cosmic analogues. We've explored how kings, priests, and scribes internalized parts of the tale to reinforce or question their own authority. But the true legacy of the Watchers among the elite wasn't their guilt or their downfall. It was the narrative framework they left behind. Stories don't simply sit on shelves or drift across marketplaces. They weave themselves into culture, quietly influencing how people understand legitimacy, danger, hierarchy, and destiny. And in this sense, the Book of Enoch became a kind of ghost architecture in the minds of the powerful, an invisible structure shaping how they ruled, how they feared, and how they justified their place in the world. To appreciate this impact, we first need to remember how myths functioned in the ancient world. They weren't entertainment. They were interpretive tools, ways of framing reality, making sense of events, and legitimizing institutions. A king's power wasn't secured by swords alone, but by the narrative explaining why he wielded them. A priest's authority wasn't ensured by rituals alone, but by the mythology that made rituals meaningful. A scribe's importance didn't come from literacy alone, but from the belief that writing connected the human world to cosmic order. Myths gave shape to authority, and the Watcher's story, with its dramatic blend of rebellion and responsibility, lent itself particularly well to elite interpretation. Consider how rulers might quietly use the tale to reinforce obedience. If the Watchers suffered cosmic punishment for stepping beyond their appointed boundaries, then earthly subjects could be warned, subtly, ceremonially, not to disrupt social orders. A king could invoke the Watchers as an example of what happens when roles are disregarded. He wouldn't need to mention angels explicitly. He could simply remind people that harmony depends on each member of society fulfilling their duty. And because the story carried cosmic weight, the message landed with more force than a simple political command. Priests, too, knew how to weave the Watchers into religious discourse. If sacred knowledge was dangerous when acquired unlawfully, then priests could position themselves as gatekeepers of the right forms of wisdom. They didn't have to accuse alternative practitioners of being like the Watchers. The implication was enough. Any unauthorized ritual, charm, divination, or medicinal practice could be framed, quietly, rhetorically, as flirting with forbidden knowledge. This reinforced priestly authority while keeping the community wary of spiritual experimentation. It is no coincidence that in many ancient cultures, Religious institutions drew sharp boundaries around who could practice certain rites or use certain herbs. Enoch's narrative validated that concern in a cosmically dramatic way. Scribes, meanwhile, found the story uniquely affirming. Enoch himself is portrayed as the first great writer, the man who records cosmic truth for earthly benefit, and the heavenly scribes Enoch encounters elevate the act of writing into a sacred duty. For human scribes working under kings, this was a source of quiet pride. They were not merely bureaucratic functionaries, they were participants in the universal act of preserving order, and the Watcher's downfall served as a reminder that miswriting, twisting truth, forging documents, recording false judgments was not merely a political failure, but a cosmic violation. Their clay tablets or parchment scrolls mirrored the heavenly tablets Enoch saw, and that comparison infused their work with gravity. Yet the elites didn't only use the story for institutional reinforcement, they absorbed it personally, shaping their own inner narratives. In ancient cultures, rulers rarely saw themselves as ordinary humans elevated by chance. They viewed themselves as inherently different, chosen by divine forces, set apart by destiny. The Watchers, strangely enough, reinforced this self-image. Here were beings of exceptional status, entrusted with oversight, placed high above ordinary life. Kings, priests, and nobles could easily see themselves reflected in that cosmic appointment, but the story complicated that reflection. It told them, status is not security, privilege is not immunity, even divine appointees can fall. This created a tension at the top. Elites wanted the part of the story that validated hierarchy. They appreciated the image of a universe built on ranks, boundaries, and roles, but they were less comfortable with the part that emphasized consequences. For every king who interpreted the Watchers as models of what not to do, another might interpret them as warnings he hoped no one remembered. For every priest who saw the story as a tool for maintaining ritual purity, another might wonder whether some forbidden strand of knowledge had seeped into his own teachings. The myth pressed on the elite conscience in ways that other myths didn't. It unsettled even as it clarified. It imposed humility even as it structured authority. And yet, elites were also storytellers in their own right. They reshaped myths, reinterpreted symbols, edited texts, and commissioned versions of stories that aligned with their needs. Over generations, the story of the Watchers evolved as it passed through elite hands. In some retellings, the Watchers became almost heroic, tragic figures whose desires mirrored human frailty. In others, they became more monstrous, serving as cautionary symbols for obedience. Some scribes softened the consequences, presenting the Watchers as misguided rather than malicious. Others sharpened them, using the story to reinforce strict social and moral boundaries. This flexibility allowed the story to survive political upheavals, cultural shifts, and geographical migrations. The Watchers became symbols whose meanings depended on who was invoking them. A king might cite their rebellion to justify harsh measures against sedition. A priest might cite their punishment to warn against sacrilege. A scribe might invoke their story when writing legal codes, embedding cosmic warnings into earthly law. The myth became a quiet, powerful influence, shaping decisions, guiding reforms, coloring anxieties. And through all of this, the elites were contributing to something larger, the preservation of the Book of Enoch itself. Ordinary people rarely controlled which texts were copied and passed down. That task belonged to elite scribal networks, royal archives, temple libraries, and scholarly circles. The survival of the story, even as it was excluded from later canons, depended on the fascination, fear, and utility it held for the powerful. They preserved it because they saw themselves in it. They copied it because it reinforced structures they valued. They repeated it because it expressed truths that were difficult to articulate openly, truths about power, responsibility, and the fragile balance between privilege and downfall. Yet there was always an undercurrent of unease in the elite relationship with Enoch's story. The myth didn't simply validate their authority, it interrogated it. It held up a cosmic example of what happens when the powerful lose restraint. It overshadowed elite ambition with the reminder that even heavenly rulers face judgment. And so, while elites used the story also used them, shaping their behavior, moderating their excesses, or at least compelling them to appear more virtuous than they might have been inclined to be. The long legacy of the Watchers among the ruling class wasn't a legacy of fear or devotion. It was a legacy of caution, the feeling that the higher one stands, the more carefully one must walk. The Watchers became the invisible advisors standing behind every throne, whispering that authority comes with boundaries, that knowledge comes with risk, and that the fall from heaven is never as far away as one imagines. And with this, we reach the end of chapter 4, the final contrast, the final lens through which to view the world shaped by the Watchers' rebellion and Enoch's revelations. From the fragile daily struggles of ordinary villagers to the introspective unease of kings and priests, the story has moved through every layer of ancient life, showing how a cosmic drama redefined the human one. All that remains now is the conclusion, the final reflection that ties Enoch's journey, humanity's burden, and the enduring power of this myth into one last slow, calming descent toward rest. As our journey with the Book of Enoch reaches its quiet closing, we step back from the cosmic architecture, the heavenly courts, the trembling Watchers, and the fragile human world stretched beneath them. We return to a place of stillness, much like Enoch himself did after witnessing the rise and collapse of celestial authority. The story does not end with thunder or fire. It ends with understanding, a soft, patient recognition of how the universe holds itself together even after it has been shaken, and how humanity, small as it is, continues to walk forward through a world shaped by forces it can barely imagine. What makes the Book of Enoch linger long after the details of forbidden knowledge and cosmic rebellion fade is its unusual blend of grandeur and intimacy. It stretches across heaven and earth, across epochs and realms, yet it is always concerned with people, how they live, how they suffer, how they hope, how they make sense of their world. And as we drift into the final reflections of this tale, the themes settle into a form that feels surprisingly familiar, even thousands of years later. We still wrestle with knowledge that arrives too quickly. We still struggle under systems that feel unfair or unstable. We still wonder why the powerful fall and why suffering spreads in ways we cannot control. The Book of Enoch doesn't remove these uncertainties. Instead, it organizes them, placing them inside a framework that feels both ancient and oddly contemporary. One of the most calming aspects of the story, though it may not seem calming at first, is the idea that imbalance does not last forever. In Enoch's visions, everything that goes wrong begins returning to order, not instantly, not painlessly, but inevitably. The Watchers who brought chaos through desire and overreach face consequences not out of vengeance but necessity. The world, overwhelmed by giants and corrupted wisdom, is washed clean so that it can breathe again. Even the stars that stray from their paths are eventually corrected. In the Enochic worldview, nothing is irreparable. The universe is not abandoned, it is tended, regulated, restored. And while that restoration may come with judgment, it also comes with renewal, a reminder that disorder is never the final state of things. For ancient listeners who lived in constant uncertainty, this was incredibly soothing. Their world felt unstable. Harvests succeeded or failed without warning. Kings rose and fell in cycles of violence. Families could lose everything to drought, war, or illness. To be told that the cosmos itself was structured toward balance, that even in moments of crisis the universe was recalibrating, provided a sense of security that everyday life rarely offered. And for us, listening now, in our own era of complexity and pressure, that same reassurance still resonates. The idea that chaos is temporary, that imbalance is noticed, that suffering is not invisible, these are comforts that transcend time. But the Book of Enoch also leaves us with an equally important truth. Knowledge alone does not save. Knowledge can elevate, but it can also overwhelm. It can create wonder and create destruction. And the difference between these outcomes is rarely about the information itself. It is about the maturity, restraint, and wisdom of the one who wields it. The Watchers had immense knowledge but lacked the self-discipline to use it responsibly. Humanity received knowledge too early and struggled to manage it. Even elites who shaped the myth for their own purposes learned that knowing too much or knowing without context could be as destabilizing as ignorance. This perspective offers a quiet lesson, one that does not demand action but invites reflection. It reminds us that wisdom grows slowly with patience and humility, and that rushing toward power, insight, or influence can lead to consequences we cannot foresee. Enoch's role in the story, calm, observant, receptive, becomes a model for how to approach the unknown. He does not seek power. He does not impose his will. He witnesses, he learns, he shares what he has understood without drama or urgency. In a world that often glorifies ambition, Enoch represents the quieter virtues of attention and comprehension. There is also something profoundly human about the way the story handles accountability. Modern narratives often portray good and evil in stark contrasts. Heroes triumph, villains fall. But the Watchers are neither heroes nor villains in a simple sense. They are beings who made errors that spiraled far beyond their intentions, and their tears, their regret, their fear, all portrayed without exaggeration, make them strangely relatable. The story doesn't ask the listener to hate them, it asks the listener to understand them. And that emotional nuance gives the myth a depth that many ancient stories lack. It suggests that wrongdoing often arises from confusion, longing, misplaced confidence, the same ingredients that shape many human mistakes. By the time Enoch descends from his visions, he has witnessed not only cosmic judgment but cosmic compassion. The universe does not delight in punishment. It carries out correction because it must. It preserves life wherever possible. It offers new beginnings after every ending, and Enoch himself becomes the embodiment of that renewal, a human who walks into the structure of heaven and emerges with clarity, ready to pass that clarity on to others. His story does not end with a throne, a kingdom, or a prophecy of dominance. It ends with knowledge delivered gently into the world, like a lantern carried into a dark room. As listeners, especially as listeners preparing for rest, this ending invites us into a softer understanding of our own experiences. We may not live under the shadow of fallen angels or giants, but we do live with the consequences of choices, ours and others, that ripple outward in ways we don't always understand. We live in systems that feel too large to influence, in stories we didn't choose, inside patterns that stretch back farther than memory. And the Book of Enoch, with all its strangeness, offers a kind of serene acceptance. It says, you don't need to fix everything. You only need to understand enough to move gently through the world. So as this story draws to a close, imagine Enoch walking back down from the heights, quietly, patiently, carrying with him the knowledge of heaven, but stepping once again onto the familiar soil of earth. He returns not as a conqueror, but as a reminder that understanding, however limited, is its own form of peace, that wisdom grows slowly, that balance returns eventually, and that even in a world shaped by cosmic mistakes, there is room for calmness, for reflection, and for rest. And wherever you are listening, whether late at night, early in the morning, or in that timeless space where wakefulness drifts into sleep, let the rhythm of this ancient story settle around you. The world may feel complicated, but it is held together by patterns older than memory. The universe may feel chaotic, but it is watched over by forces that have been correcting imbalance since the beginning. The story of the Watchers may be strange, but beneath its strangeness is a soft reassurance that order returns, that clarity emerges, and that rest is always waiting. Thank you for spending this time in the world of Enoch, and whenever your eyes grow heavy and your breath slows, may this quiet understanding accompany you into sleep, a reminder that even in the vastness of history and myth there is always a place for peace,